The night city of Gangnam District in Seoul was ablaze with lights. The D1 base of the first team in the world rankings was located in one of the high-rises. In the losers' hall sat ordinary guys. They were doing their favorite thing. Everyone had a role in their group and owned high scores. A computer mouse equipped with multicolored diodes glided across the table with incredible speed. Fingers on the keyboard beat out the rhythm of the game. The movements were clear and deliberate. The guy had already honed his skills for years. A smirk appeared on his face when he saw the very same opponent in the monitor. This player wanted to destroy Dex, who had appeared unexpectedly in the game world. The best team has gathered to give the last duel. They are ready to destroy the enemy, and once again, confirm the superiority in the game. The player stepped forward. In front of him was only one opponent with the nickname Dex. For a while, they stood silently against each other. No words were heard from Dex. His ammunition shimmered in the light. The character's eyes blazed scarlet. His visage was lofty and self-assured. He didn't like Dex and the way he talked about himself. The player character let out a battle cry. The player was eager to teach Dex a lesson, and once again remind the world that it was his team that was worthy of the top spot on the roster. The player with his sword snapped out of his seat and sped toward Dex, Dex himself standing still with only his cloak billowing in the wind. Dex drew his dark blade and gripped it more comfortably in his hand. The motion was brief, but significant. The two players came together in a single blow. The light scattered around them, and weapons clanked in the bright light. One blow was enough to end the fight. The character's hand flew off to the side, while still clutching the sword tightly. Growling in agony, the player is defeated and began to disintegrate into thousands of pixels, disappearing from the game. The team caught up the guys together, headed towards the enemy who had destroyed the leader with one combo. One of the players used a mysterious skill and began to disperse into space, becoming invisible. With a silent move, he managed to slip behind the back of his opponent. Being confident in his abilities, the team player prepared to attack. Only he didn't even realize Dex could sense his presence. The character's head turned sharply, and red eyes gleamed from beneath his helmet. As the blades came together, sparks flew from the sides. The invisible man's attack was not a proper success. Dex figured out the plan and protected his back. Dex was able to strike back. Firepower filled the field, leaving the player with a notice that he had lost. The enemy's lunge was colossal, and in front of them already hung a sign that committed a double destruction. Fire flickered around the character's body. One player grimaced in indignation. Dex easily destroyed the main characters. The other player was not discouraged and was confident in his abilities. Meanwhile, Dex didn't stand still. He took off toward the main group of players, speeding up, and at some point the player soared above the group. The defense broke the second the enemy's blade passed through their bodies. The player sitting in front of the monitor could not believe he has never once felt so weak. Their team was simply destroyed. A single player could take out an entire team of losers. It was a triumph for him, and a miserable defeat for the former leaders. The guy kept staring at the monitor. He wanted to know who Dex was. On the screen was the character. Dex turned his head as if to mock the team's pathetic loss one last time. The player skillfully controlling the character leaned back in his chair. Young Jae-yoon was the real name of the guy who was playing for Dex now. Before that, he had a bunch of other names that didn't matter. He wanted to become a leader in the top players. The guy picked up a can of Pringles and rubbed it with crumbs, but unfortunately the chips were out. Licking his lips, Yoon gathered the rest of the crumbs. The decision to go get another can of chips was lightning fast. The player from the leading team looked at the list with annoyance. He was furious that Dex had moved up to the top spot. He didn't want to believe that some single and unknown player could outrun them. And at a time when it seemed like it couldn't get any worse, Dex cheerfully said goodbye to the players, as if nothing had happened. A white van was driving down the road picking up speed. The men were having fun discussing the news. One of them had not watched yesterday's D1 stream and was unaware of what had happened there. The car shook from the shouting. Neither of the guys liked the subject because he was rooting for the famous team that ended up losing. Now all eyes are on the other. There were signs all over the city advertising Arcadia's incredible and innovative game. Only, it wasn't an ordinary game. The company created a capsule called the Dreamer, which can only be played by immersing yourself in virtual reality. Everything was possible in the game. Immersing body and mind players can enjoy an exciting life and unlimited possibilities. Commercials were everywhere, enticing players to try out the new game and experience virtual reality. The car with the workers arrived at the last point. The man once again checked the documents, and the other remarked that the owner had better not spend money on games. Only Jae-yoon didn't care. He was anxiously awaiting the capsule with which he could immerse himself in virtual reality. In the welcome window was a character with the nickname Dex. He took another look at his creation and hit the delete button. Now Yoon would be able to dive into something new and uncharted. He climbed into the Dreamer and proceeded to check in. A few minutes later, a new player, Jae-yoon, entered the world of Arcadia and was able to see the beauty and vastness of the game from an aerial perspective. The first impression was filled with excitement. He wonders how many adventures and mysteries the new, different game holds in itself. There are many games in the world, and in these games, there are secrets that the developers have hidden for the players. It could be little jokes or game-changing cheats and tricks. The developers were like gods in this world. Someone mysterious quietly spoke. A slight smile touched his lips. He was going to provide some mystery. Game system. Alice accepted the secret that the guy had passed on the girl's hands, lit up with a greenish light, and she clutched it to her chest, without emotion. Jae-yoon found himself in the starting city. The guy watched the life around him with admiration. The players were already making friends. Going outside, the player immediately plunged into the world. All around, something shouted. Dex looked around uncertainly. Everything seemed very real and no different from the regular world. With a wave of his hand, a console opened in front of the player with the settings of skills and characteristics of his character. He was now at level 1. The nickname was the same. The vault contained 3 main items. Putting his hand to his lips, Dex continued to study the interface. Every button was where it was supposed to be. The first quest was to destroy one slime. It was a light green-colored monster that looked like a jelly bean. There was something interesting in the game. Arcadia is difficult to move sharply, so destroying the slime was not easy. To avoid such situations in the game, were developed different skills that can be improved and used. The moment Dex met face-to-face with the slime mob immediately reacted to his presence. For Jae-yoon, nothing was impossible. The guy attacked with ease. This strike was enough to complete the task. He loved the feel of this game. His whole body was engaged, and Dex was pleased with himself. Thinking that he would be able to pump up his character very quickly, Dex opened the console, his face contorted with surprise, because Dex didn't realize that the next task was to read 100 books. The Edelin library was silent. 2 girls sat at a long table, each busy with something. After noticing something interesting, one girl turned to the other. The girl's friend was in no hurry to take her eyes off the book. In front of them was a player sitting at a table reading books 24 hours a day. It was not unusual for a girl with glasses to be in the library. Because of the assignment, other players borrowed books and just flipped through them. None of the players had read the books, and Dex was too stubborn to read all of them. The girl with glasses looked up at the guy. Her decision was that the player would simply soon get bored and do the same as the others. Suddenly, Dex got up from his seat and walked over to the girls. Guy pointed to a copy of the book and asked if they had a second volume. The girl with glasses looked at him in surprise, not believing that the player had actually read the book, and asked for a sequel. Putting the book down, Dex admitted he found it interesting. Now he wanted to know more and thought he would find the answers in the second volume. Dex looked down at the title of the book. It was called The History of Arcadia Volume 1. After a few seconds, the librarian put down the second volume in a polite voice and asked me to remember to return the... Before going to continue reading, Dex looked up. He wanted to know why this particular book was kept separate. The girl bowed her head and looked at the player enigmatically. This book was only given out by direct request. For others, it was inaccessible. Dex, satisfied with the answer, held out his hand toward the book. He didn't yet know what had earned it such attention. The moment the player's fingers touched the cover, something in the game system began to happen. Alice was engaged. Around wrapped-up notices, among which she found in the initial city of Edeline, a special event is discovered. Dex was now marked by the system as worth special attention. He looked down at the book with a smile on his face. Once upon a time in the game, Universe traveled a legendary adventurer, and he had a certain treasure. The traveler hid it at the bottom of a lake near the initial city. For years, rumors about it have been circulating, but no one has been able to find the treasure. The only thing we know is that the treasure was called the First Trace of Darkness. It looked like a small pendant with a bright heart and wings. It was rumored that Ezreal hid it at the bottom of the lake. But because no one found it, the legend gradually faded into oblivion. Dex read the lines carefully and studied the information with curiosity. His fingers traced the rough page of the Edelin map, where Dex found the lake, and thought it was probably what the legend was referring to. Sometime later at sunset, the player reached the lake. Guy put his hands in his pockets and looked around. He didn't believe the book, but he couldn't ignore the knowledge, so he decided to find out for himself. Suddenly, a notification window appeared overhead. He immediately turned his attention to it. After the first window, many others appeared. All said that a special assignment had been created. He was given the main assignment, which said he had to find the Trail of Darkness. And at the bottom of Lake Aruna, there was indeed something special. In the darkness, where no warm light reached, someone slept, curled up in a ball. Dex looked around at the strange assignment. He couldn't see anything out of the ordinary, and it seemed strange to the guy. His gaze returned to the lake. Dex mumbled a passage from the book about the treasure being at the bottom. Realizing that there was no other way out, the guy rolled up his sleeves, and Dex was completely absorbed in the gameplay. And after a moment of gaining a full lungful of air, the player jumped off the pier straight into the lake. The water was met with a chill. Dex opened his eyes and peered intently into the depths. His eyes widened when a realization came to him. The lake was unexpectedly deep. The player could not see its bottom. This was a real confirmation that the player was on the right track. At this time, something happened in the Korean branch of Arcadia. The main scenario of the game is open. The staff looked at the notice with bewilderment. Kwon Myung-chan's eyebrows furrowed at the bridge of his nose as the director scratched the back of his head. What kind of player could open the main story task so quickly? A staff member appeared behind me and told me that a player had come into contact with an object related to the main scenario. Realizing that they don't know more information yet, Moo-yoon exhaled heavily and gave instructions. All this should also be reported to the president of the company. The staff went to carry out the orders of the director, who continued to stand and stare at the warning notice. As he did so, Myung-chan's jaws clenched tightly. In the US, the game has been running for 3 months and it's been peaceful there. Dex floated out of the water, greedily inhaling the air. He'd been down to the bottom of the lake more than once before, but he'd never reached his goal. The guy waded out to the shore and sat down tiredly. Now, a lot of notice boards opened up. Each attempt to get to the bottom increased his diving skill. Since the game just opened, there were no leaders. Players were rapidly developing characters to break through to the top. Jae-yoon clenched his fists in anger. He felt that he didn't have time to pump up the diving skill. Sadly, he realized he needed to find something of value, and now he was doing the wrong thing. And yet this quest could have solved the problems nobody knew about this quest. It would be a shame if it ended up being something mediocre. Silikoff's main office in US Silicon Valley was a large glass surrender. Janica Pohl was the young chairman of the company. The girl was lying in her bed resting. A sudden beep brought the girl out of her slumber. Her eyes opened wide and her heart thudded in her chest. She immediately gathered her thoughts. It became known that someone in Korea had opened a major mission. Sitting in front of a huge screen, the girl listened to the report. Jenica began roughly tying back her hair. She was out of her mind for someone managing to leave the main assignment in the initial city. Then a voice on the screen said that it wasn't the writing team who did it, but a certain person. As soon as Jenica heard this, her face immediately grinned. It was obvious that the girl didn't have good feelings for him. She grabbed her tablet and started actively flipping through all the information. After a couple minutes, she managed to find information about this assignment. It said about the secret class Bard of Anarchy. She wondered if he could play such a worthless character. Then a voice from the screen distracted her. It turned out that the player would receive a unique ability. Jenica returned her gaze to the tablet and found the place where the unique ability was described. Her eyes widened. It's been 10 days since Jae-yoon began his task. At some point, a hand with a string appeared on the surface of the water. Dex picked up the object and looked at it from different angles. A satisfied smirk appeared on his face. In addition, the guy also had improvements in other skills. All the windows that reported this began to flicker in front of his face. Jae-yoon scrutinized the Necklace of Darkness. Now he was facing a very serious choice of whether to use this item or not. Then he activated the Necklace of Darkness. A sign appeared. A choice had to be made. A hand reached out in agreement. He clicked the yes button, and then a dozen more of the same signs appeared, asking the same question over and over again. At some point, a new window popped up, but the text was written as if it was personally addressed by the developer. The one who was closely watching the progress of this task was on the other side of the game. This mysterious man smiled. Jae-yoon tensed up and didn't realize the consequences that would happen to him. But there was no turning back. There was no turning back. Around the guy, a bright light lit up. The game colored the sky in dark and bright highlights. Then a statue appeared with a lantern, and a golden light poured out of it. A window popped up that Dex had gotten the hidden class of Bard of Anarchy. Notifications flashed before the player's eyes again. The guy's look changed to one of surprise and confusion. The pumping system had been removed from the character. The main assignment was not simple. He had to destroy the newcomers for 6 days. The player used his skill and prepared to attack the slime. He was confident in his strength. Firepower burst out of his body and flew through the slime like a bullet. It was enough to destroy the monster. After, from the slime, fell out a small object core. The player was pleased with such an acquisition. The girl came closer to him and whistled enviously. Dex, hidden behind a tree, watched the newcomers closely. He still couldn't get his head around the fact that he was going to destroy them. The player didn't like what the game was now forcing him to do. At the moment, it seemed mean and low to him. An hour later, sitting in front of the monitor, Jae-yoon tried to delete the character but was unsuccessful. Jae-yoon's gaze sank. He didn't even realize that this game would only be able to create a single character. There's a reason the game warned him so many times and asked him to reconsider, but who knew it would turn out this way? Now Dex couldn't delete the character and start over. He'd have to deal with what he chose to do on his own. The guy scrutinized the description. His gaze wandered to the windows of the game and his face became more and more thoughtful. The level marker disappeared and it was a classic for all games. He realized with horror that he could no longer progress. And with each passing day, the gap between him and the other players would only widen. This fact depressed him to no end. Jae-yoon remembered the system's words that he would have to wreak havoc and confusion in the game from now on. Sadness weighed heavily on the boy's shoulders. He blamed himself for not heeding those warnings and bringing such misfortune upon himself. Drowning in his own thoughts, Dex collapsed on the grass. Spreading his arms and legs, the guy didn't even want to get up and do anything. He realized that there was nothing he could change. Even though it pissed him off, the player was willing to accept reality. Afterward, Dex did get up and began his search, examining the character status window more carefully. He managed to find a scale called Decency. His eyebrows drew together at the bridge of his nose. He had no idea what it was. Dex found a brief description with text that raised even more questions for him. And so he stood hiding behind a tree and watched the newcomers were uncomfortable with the assignment. In front of him were 2 men who were enjoying the company and had no idea that someone might want to destroy them. At some point, Dex decided to just turn a blind eye and do what the game demanded. The player drew his weapon. In his heart, he was still uncomfortable doing such atrocities, but he had no other choice. The guys continued to stand there talking to each other and didn't realize that someone was after them. A player suddenly appeared on the field. He did not accidentally kick the guy with his shoulder, then turned and looked at the victim with annoyance. The player is disappointed that he couldn't take out at once. The girl next to him immediately crouched down near the fallen. She demanded an explanation. Glum laughter erupted all around. 3 unknown men hovered over the boys. They were clearly unwilling to engage in friendly relations. The leader of their company opened his mouth and said that the land was theirs. Of course, they didn't like anyone hunting on their property. Meanwhile, Dex stood back and watched the scene. Putting his sword on his shoulders, the player looked on at the mayhem. The girl did not like the words of those who came. She started shouting and proving that this area was for newcomers. The man came closer to the girl so that their noses almost touched. He looked at her with a threatening look. The player who thought he was in charge here was already level 12, and his nickname was highlighted in scarlet. Lying on the ground, immediately noticed the red nickname and realized that these guys have already destroyed other peaceful players more than once. The girl watched with frightened eyes as he easily threatened to find her in real life and get even. The bandits had an overpowering sense of power, so they were able to make such dire threats without fear. Realizing that she and her friend would not be able to fight the villains, the girl turned her head to the side and screamed loudly. She tried to call for help, except that the other players stood back and silently watched this situation. No one rushed to their aid. The kid pulled himself up and tried to find out what the bandits were doing this for. He wanted nothing more than to enjoy the game. Such a statement went unanswered, only a loud laugh broke out. They were amused by such a naive reaction from these guys. The guy once again realized that there was no point in talking to them. Pride was hurt, and he could do nothing to counter it. The man loomed over the player and claimed that they were in a virtual reality where the rules of the normal world had no force. There was a sudden whistling sound, followed by a foot in the air. One of the bandits fell to the ground and squealed loudly with a stare at his leg. The rest of the friends turned around, frightened at the scream. At that very moment, Dex spoke up, smiling, and said that he could have taken that thug out with one punch. The player didn't wait for the bandits to realize. Like lightning, the guy swept through them, unleashing the wrath of his weapons. It was truly a superb attack. He managed to get 3 players in one blow at once. There was nothing the bandits could do. It seemed at that moment the whole world turned red. Dex stood there and felt as he had just wiped out several players for no reason. Nick, above the guy's head, turned red. As soon as players were eliminated, pop-ups appeared in front of Dex, informing him that he had eliminated a player and was given 1 decency point for doing so. Dex heard a voice behind him. He turned around and realized it was thanking him for protecting the boys from the bandits. The girl and her friend were overjoyed at the defense. They wanted to know how they could thank this player. Dex himself was in no hurry to accept the thanks. He looked at them with a casual look and warned them they were dead. The boys froze in place with twisted faces. They obviously didn't expect to hear something like that from their savior. With a smile to his neck, Dex asked these guys not to take much offense. He just needed to follow the directions of the assignment. At first, the player thought it was a joke, but the moment he saw Dex's smile, he realized the player in front of him wasn't joking. The player's scream echoed the second the weapon swept across his body. That was the end of him. The other players watched in bewilderment at what was happening. When he was done with those guys, Dex turned to the rest of the players. A villainous smile appeared on his face. Realizing the guy's intentions were serious, the players rushed out. Since that day, the Arcadia forum has been abuzz with rumors of a player who went crazy and destroyed everyone. It was dark and quiet in the night forest. Only an owl sat on a branch, and its yellow eyes glittered in the darkness. A quick stomp of feet shattered the silence. The player ran and howled in fear, trying to find help around him. He was very scared and most of all wanted to find a place to hide. The player fell to the ground and exhaled heavily. In front of him appeared a notice he was injured, and his advancement speed decreased. Breathing heavily, he tried to get to his feet, but he could feel the ominous aura at his back and the approach of whoever was chasing him. A man dressed in a dark cloak came into the light, his head covered by a thick hood. It was hard to see his face. The guy noticed the approaching player, and excitement filled his body even more. Eyes widened with terror. Jae-yun stepped out of the shadows of the forest and approached the prey. His gaze was insane. He felt no shame for his actions. Crawling back, the guy started yelling about how he hadn't done anything wrong to be destroyed for. Words didn't help. Dex wasn't going to have a conversation with him, so he raised his weapon and swung it. At the last moment, the player blurted out words that he would file a complaint with the administration. He promised that the villain would not just get away with it. At these words, Dex lowered his weapon, and a heavy sigh escaped from his mouth. Apparently, this was not the first time he had heard such threats. The guy looked intently at the player in a calm voice. Dex said that this task was given to him by the game developers themselves. The player's eyes bulged, and he couldn't believe what he was hearing. Could it really be true? A second later, his face split in two. Dex was no longer willing to make excuses about it. After the go, Dex yawned sweetly. He hadn't been out in a while and was tired of it. Arcadia had a system of punishing players. After being sent to the other world, the user was blocked access for a day, and it was a big problem for the technical department. People were taking calls from a lot of players, furious that they were being restricted because of someone. The CEO walked into the office and looked in suspense at the simmering work. Behind stood an employee and talked about how they had a pile of complaints. The man immediately tensed up. He didn't like hearing that. He wanted to know more details about what was going on. Jae-yun opened a window with information about his current progress. In just 2 sleepless nights, he was able to accomplish over 1,000 eliminations. The tired player yawned once more. Until this point, he had thought it would be a little easier to destroy newcomers. Dex was really worried that he wasn't in trouble, and at the same time, he was thinking that the game itself had given him this assignment. The boy heard a strange sound behind him. He turned to the side. The slimes started coming out of the forest, and there were a lot of them. All of them looked sad and looked like they were about to cry. Suddenly, a window popped up in front of Dex, that he had saved the slimes, and now they had sympathy for him. As in a second, a whole crowd of slimes swarmed the player from all sides and showed him unbridled love and gratitude. It was a revelation, continuing to cuddle with the slime guy. Until this moment, he was sure he had only made enemies during the game. After a while, he and the other slimes heard someone's voice. The speaker was far away, so it was impossible to make out the words. 4 lights appeared in the darkness of the forest, and there were more voices. Someone was discussing something very actively with someone else. Dex watched the approach for a while. His face became serious now. He had to figure out how to proceed. The player put his hand on the slime's head and stroked it lightly. He had to say goodbye to them and leave, because he was worried they would hunt him down. Dex's instincts were right. There were indeed players in the woods trying to track down the madman who was destroying all the newcomers. Unfortunately for Dex, the angry players immediately noticed the shadow and the cloak rapidly moving away from them. Dex sensed his pursuers behind him, so he ran as fast as he could. He noticed that the dense forest was dissipating with each meter, and he was about to enter open territory. After a moment, Dex stopped abruptly and had nowhere else to go but the cliff behind him. The leader smiled with his mouth full. He realized that the player had been cornered, and now they would be able to deal with him. Without a word, Dex bent over backwards toward the cliff. No one expected him to make that move. Dex promptly began to fall off the cliff, and the other players ran to the edge in surprise to look at this madman. The leader was very surprised that the guy dared to take such a step. He realized that in front of him was really a crazy player. The player flew in freefall, feeling the wind slamming into his back. He did what he thought was right, and he wasn't scared. Under the shadow of his hood was visible only the smile of a madman enjoying the game to the fullest, and then he pronounced, "Saved his character's exit." On the same day, there was already a video on the internet about a strange villain who was fearless. The player who tried to catch the bad guy was one of the ones Dex destroyed. The guy was trying to find all the information on the forums. He decided that such a player should be taught a lesson, so he started looking for people to go on a raid with him. Already in the morning, the boys had gathered in one group. Their leader thanked them all for deciding to teach the villain a lesson. The player's gaze was angry. He no longer wanted some freak to continue destroying innocent newcomers. Artificial intelligence. Alice immediately recognized that a group of people had gathered wanting to destroy the same player. Alice immediately began generating an event that would be suitable for players to capture their villain. A window appeared in front of the player's face with a notification that a new task had been created. The guy looked at it thoughtfully. The same notifications appeared to the rest of the players. All were surprised by the new task. To fulfill it, you need to catch assassin in the hunting grounds. A warning appeared in Arcadia's Korean section. Employees crowded around him and didn't understand how this could happen. The man was furious that someone had let a non-approved task into the game. He demanded that the matter be dealt with. Kang Dae-hoon shouted at the staff at the top of his voice. He didn't understand how an entire team of professionals could make such a mistake. The employees had nothing to answer. They all stood in their seats and remained silent. The man exhaled heavily without finding understanding in their eyes. This was a serious incident. Everyone looked at the red screen and realized that this kind of assignment was not uncommon and could not bring problems to the game. Dae-hoon twitched when he heard from a coworker that this assignment was related to the first act of the main assignment chain. The man didn't expect things to turn so fast. The other countries were quiet, but they're in a real uproar. A seed in the soil was like a scenario. The seed didn't germinate immediately. It took some time. Supposedly, it should have taken a few months for the scenario to unfold, as it should have. The manager scrutinized all the information. He didn't believe that everything was really happening, but the statistics and calculations only confirmed it. There's a player in the game who's been dubbed the Rookie Destroyer. The video of this guy went viral all over the internet. Dae-hoon asked his subordinate about it. The man hesitated. He had to tell him that there was a player going around the grounds destroying newcomers. The manager wanted to find out more about this player, but someone from the head office restricted all information. The man tensed up with more questions. Dae-hoon's eyes widened with renewed vigor when he noticed another important piece of information in front of him was the number of people destroyed. Jae-yoon was sleeping peacefully in his bed. He was so tired that he shamelessly let himself get a good night's rest. The guy heard a soft click and an accompanying sound. Jae-yoon's eyes flickered open, pulling him out of a deep sleep. The game introduced a special event in which players had to catch a serial assassin. Jae-yoon looked at the poster in horror and was shocked that he was going to be hunted down. He logged onto the forum and stared dumbfounded at the number of comments. He didn't want to quit the game, but such a desire to destroy it caused fear. He approached the capsule and looked at it doubtfully. He had mixed feelings about the fact that this machine was not cheap at all. Eventually, seeing no other way out, Dex returned to the game. He climbed a hill with a clear view of the hunting ground. The guy had no idea the game would create a mission where players would have to hunt him down. There were slimes scurrying around, but no players around little monsters jumping around the game field without a care. Dex was about to decide that he should look for another place for the assignment when a familiar voice came from behind him. The guy looked at him, and he looked kind of sad. It perplexed the player. Slime couldn't talk about his problem, but when the guy heard the voices of the players, he realized the monster had come for help. There were a few players in the woods. They were discussing problems. One complained that having chosen the mage class, he now has difficulty pumping. The player with the nickname Acaps noticed that someone was in front of him. His attention immediately shifted from the conversation to the enemy. There was someone standing in front of the guy, a player in a black cape, and next to him was the slime that those players came for. The boys immediately rushed forward, eager to get their prey. They shouted to the player that it was their slime and they would take it for themselves. The shouting continued, and it appeared that the two men had already wounded the little monster and considered it their own. Dex silently cast his eyes downward. Slime looked at his savior with a sad and very pleading look. He was obviously looking for help from Dex. Realizing this, Dex's gaze shifted to the newcomers moving toward them. He'd already made his decision. Stepping forward, the guy picked up his hood behind his back. The guy stopped, not realizing what this player would do. Acaps grimaced. He didn't like that the player wasn't being friendly, but the other one got nervous. He felt like he'd seen him somewhere before. The hood was thrown over Dex's head. His stern gaze traveled over the pair of players. Acaps was still trying to get an answer to his question, but all his attempts were futile. This infuriated the player even more. When Dex got too close, Acaps tried to push him, but the guy was easily able to dodge. The hand grabbed the air. Dex looked up at them, already anticipating the next stage of the entertaining dialogue. A madman's smile spread across his lips. When Dex screamed that he was going to be destroyed, Acaps' face twisted. The guy didn't notice his nickname turn red. He didn't realize what was happening. Dex fell to the ground, clutching his arm, and continued to yell that the assassin was going to destroy him. Acaps didn't understand why he was acting this way. The other players nearby heard the screams that the assassin was here. They were so eager for revenge that their eyes lit up. All of them were just as eager to receive the reward for the task. The players began to advance towards Acaps and his friend. The unfortunate man tried to justify himself and poke the stranger, saying it was a lie. But Dex was already running away from those guys, and with him the slime Acaps was terrified. Now he'd have to deal with the ravaged mob. Some ran to the attack with cries of reward, while others longed for a sense of justice and revenge for all the newcomers. Acaps and his friend didn't think that, because of some slime, they would get into such a situation. The players were getting closer, and the guys couldn't escape. In a moment, the magician realized where he'd seen that evil look. The boy realized they'd met that assassin and gotten into trouble. A memory of that very same video clip of the serial destroyer flashed before the player's eyes. Dex crouched on the stump and exhaled heavily. So the trick worked. They managed to escape. Slime was bouncing around him quite a bit. The player picked up the slime and was surprised that the little monster managed to keep up. The slime itself enjoyed being with the player. The slime acted like a pet that missed its owner very much. Sitting with the slime in his arms, a new notification box popped up in front of Dex's face. The boy looked up. It said that for saving the slime, the sympathy of their race had increased, and Dex had become a friend to them. The guy wasn't surprised, as he actually destroyed too many newbies while saving the slime race. Dex lowered his head. He was glad he had friends on his side, but they were all first level and wouldn't be able to help him much. In front of the player popped up more new notifications, one of them most attracted because the slimes could be helped with his decency. The boy's eyes moved to the slime, and the interest in his soul grew with each passing moment. Without thinking, Dex raised his hand and pointed it at the slime. An energy force formed around them, and the slime rose into the air. Before the game decided to ask if the player wished to use decency points, Dex had no doubt he would have to find out what would happen. As soon as he pressed the button, a stone statue appeared in the sky, with a lantern in its hand that lit up with a warm golden light. The moment decency passed to the slimes, their level immediately increased. The little monsters were level 15. Monsters in games have always had a purpose, and it was to act as an adversary for the player. Warriors to pump up their character stood up to monsters in terrible battles, and even if they failed, they found ways to become stronger. Also in each game, there were monsters created for beginners. On them, players practiced pumping up their skills. Arcadia was no exception, and the role of training monsters was given to slime small and non-threatening monsters. On the official channel of the game, there were many different videos that helped new players to learn more nuances. But just recently, a new one came out that caused a stir. The level 1 slimes suddenly became too strong. Player decided to make a review of the game and first impressions. As soon as he entered, he lowered his eyes to his hands and was surprised by the graphics. The guy looked around the area. There was no one around. It seemed like he was in a real forest somewhere in the real world. Turning his gaze to the side was a cute little slime. Guy raised his sword ready to destroy the little monster. Except, he didn't expect the slime to lunge at the player like a madman. The guy started calling for help. But after just a few seconds, the slime was able to easily overpower the player and destroy him. The broadcast was interrupted, and the video was over. As a result of the decency points spent, the slimes gained too much power. They stopped being cute monsters. The guys on the battlefield did not understand what was going on. They were not able to do damage, and the monsters themselves could easily destroy the player. Dex was watching the madness from up on the hill. The guy didn't think such a harmless act could cause such a commotion. The guy also noticed that before the slimes never attacked first, but everything changed. They became aggressive and pounced on players. The man raised his sword in full tension. Slime was jumping in front of him and could attack his opponent at any moment. Dex kept watching. He knew that this change in behavior was because he had raised their level. The moment I gave all the decency to the slimes, their behavior changed a lot. Now it's clear how the ability could affect the course. Dex's gaze shifted to the battlefield. Something caught his eye and all thoughts of slimes faded into the background. A group of players standing around, guys back to back trying to protect each other. These were the same players who decided to go after Dex. The leader was furious. Guys shouted, ordering the slimes to get out. They didn't understand why the calm monsters had such a change in behavior. One of the slimes flew up into the air and was over the player's head as the player followed the slime with frightened eyes and put his shield forward. Slime, on the other hand, was left with a smile. Now, when monsters provided a threat to everyone, they looked intimidating. The reinforced slime destroyed the newcomer, then galloped away with a satisfied face. The guys looked at it all with their eyes wide open and realized that now the game has changed a lot. The slimes continued to attack the humans and wiped out the players one by one. It was an incredible revelation for Dex to learn that every destruction by slime now gave him one decency point. The boy licked his lips with anticipation. Now the game would be different. Slimes could do his dirty work for him. 2 hours later, the guy had over 3,000 decency points on his account. Dex was pleased with the turn of events. Dex decided that he could improve the slimes more, but the game frustrated him. The boy exhaled in frustration. He looked at the army of slimes that circled around him. This level was enough to eliminate the newcomers. Now that the work was done, Dex was free to go on his way, leaving the slimes behind and trusting them to do the important work. The Korean section of Arcadia was not quiet. Myung-chan stood up from his desk and clapped his hands loudly. There was an oppressive atmosphere around him. The CEO's look was menacing. The man demanded a fresh report on the current situation in the game. The manager stepped forward and started talking about the fact that the level of slimes has increased because of this increased problems of newcomers. The man's voice trembled. There was a dialogue between them. The director was sure that the level of slimes might have increased, but hearing this made the employee shudder again. As scared as he was, he corrected his boss and reported that the power of the slimes had increased by a factor of 6. Mu Yung-chang froze in place, and his face stretched in surprise. The man clearly did not expect to hear such shocking information. For a while, the principal hovered. He still couldn't believe that slimes could become so powerful. The rest of the staff stood with drooping faces. Their hands were downcast. And so the director came out of his thoughts and wanted to know the amount of health of the newcomers. Such a harsh question made the manager shudder. He swallowed loudly because the newcomers only had 100 points of vitality. Mu Yung-chan froze. One small truth came to him. The power of the slime was unbelievable to the newcomer players. The manager immediately realized what his boss was thinking and only confirmed his guess with a brief nod of his head. Slimes were now able to absolutely effortlessly destroy with a single blow. Cute little monsters didn't seem like that anymore. The man didn't say anything else. He took off and went somewhere. His head was spinning with many thoughts, but one was that it couldn't be a mistake. He could not leave the situation without attention. In the room, the door opened, and on the threshold stood the director, and in front of him, he saw a dreamer. The man climbed into the capsule with the clear intention of figuring out if he couldn't figure it out, then he needed to take the plunge and learn from the inside out. After going through all the steps of authorization system allowed him to enter, Myung-chan will be able to figure out and find out how this could happen. He made his way to the artificial intelligence Alice. The artificial intelligence was recreated in the form of a young girl who was responsible for many processes in the operation of the game. Alice met the executive without much of a greeting. The girl looked at the man silently. The newcomers' hunting grounds were too empty. Dex looked around the area and couldn't find a single player. Dex has noticed that the growth of decency has slowed down. The newcomers are no longer eager to come here. He pressed his hand to his chin and thought for a while. But that wasn't the end of it. The level 15 players who had managed to pump up before the slimes got stronger returned to the grounds. Dex realized that he could no longer create stronger slimes, but even so, decency was slowly growing, and it wasn't bad. Suddenly, decency has grown to 10,000, and Dex is notified that he is being rewarded for it. His curiosity got the best of him, and the guy immediately pressed the activation button. Dark violet energy erupted around them. A rushing wind blew, sweeping away everything around them. Dex was startled and didn't understand why the middle bounty was activated that way. At some point, the bright light slammed down and turned into a small-sized core. The wind died down, and the player's curiosity got the better of him. He stopped being afraid and looked at the nucleus in a different way. The core turned out to be really such a strange egg opened. The energy continued to rage, and Dexu sprinkled notifications. From the egg emerged a huge monster that was several times larger than the player. He had wings sharp and huge. His clawed hands clutched energy. The monster's entire body was angular and pointed. The familiar came to his senses and looked at the player with a blazing gaze. He wanted to know how some human dared to summon him. Dex himself was no longer afraid at all. The boy looked at the surname with delight. The monster's aura was intimidating. Dex's eyes stared in surprise at the plaque that had a full description of the familiars. The one who now stood before Dex was none other than Chaos Lord Satan, the Demon Lord. The familiar examined his body and was glad to be back in the shape of his youth. Except the demon probably hasn't realized how much smaller Dex is. Dex was several times larger. The demon started to look around his body once more in horror and didn't realize where he was or why he was so small. Anger blazed out of the little monster. He raised his head and turned menacingly to Dex. The boy looked questioningly around. Dex scratched the back of his head. The player had just opened the reward the game gave him. The demon himself was in complete shock at what had happened. Apparently, he didn't understand how this could happen. He could have had a seizure from the situation he was in. Dex continued to watch the demon as he fell to his knees, clutching his head and staggering from side to side. The player was well aware that he was facing a real demon lord who had too much power. Despite the fact that most of the demon's power was now gone, his demeanor had not changed. He acted as if he were king of the entire planet. The demon climbed on top of Dex's head and sat down. With his hands on his chest, he saw no other choice but to find an understanding between them. The guy's eyes narrowed because he didn't know how to react to this demon's behavior. He was acting too casual. Suddenly, the demon got off his head and looked at Dex with interest. He suspected that the man might have an interesting power. As it turned out, Dex could have spent the decency to reveal the familiars. The system warned him of the danger and deception. After all, he was dealing with a demon. The familiar circled around and began begging the player for power. Dex still wasn't quite sure what the demon was getting at. Then the demon jabbed his finger at him and proudly spoke of a power that could turn reality upside down. Dex only now realized what the demon was talking about. His eyes widened, and he didn't expect to be able to use his power. Decency points did have great power. It was because of them that Dex was able to increase the level of slimes and bring about chaos. The demon continued to say that a normal player would not be able to take advantage of this familiar, once again insisted that he could thank the player. Dex has already imagined what gratitude would be like. He didn't realize the game could change so much. The realization of the value came very timely. Such a desire of the demon to get them only confirmed the guy's hunch. The demon only smiled as he realized that he had piqued the man's interest and would be able to get what he wanted. In an instant, the demon swung his hand and a cloak appeared between them. Even in America, a few months earlier, players had only reached the 50th levels. The demon had no doubt that his master would refuse the reward. With a snap of his fingers, the cloak vanished into thin air in an instant. The surname wanted to know what his master wanted. Dex stared at the demon for a while, puzzled. But after a moment, a brilliant idea came to mind. He came up with a wish, and it was suddenly like a light bulb went off in his head. Raising his head, Dex wondered if he could reinforce the monsters. Familiar hovered for a few seconds. And what was the demon's surprise when his master suddenly wished to increase the power of the slimes? After a couple seconds, the demon broke into laughter. This was the first time he had ever received such a request in his entire history. After calming down, the surname poked himself with his thumb, smiled, and assured him that he could easily handle the request. Dex was glad to hear that, and as a thank you, he was willing to give everything. And there were almost 9,000 of them. A magic circle appeared under their feet. Thus, a contract was made between them. Dark clouds gathered over the hunting ground, from which purple lightning bolts struck the ground. A huge monster appeared above the woods. It was a slime queen that was level 100. The fire lance came into action, and power burst from the weapon, slicing another slime into 2 pieces. Players who were already a bit pumped up returned to the site and resumed slime hunting. The guys knew that this place was too dangerous for newcomers, but they could develop their characters without strain. Satisfied, they went on in search of new victims. They were very much engrossed in their conversations, and even did not immediately feel a slight tremor in the ground. In a moment, the ground beneath their feet was shaking. Dark and oily energy began to burst out of the ground. All this was accompanied by a terrible voice. The Invisible One urged the slimes to rise up and avenge countless innocent lives. The slimes were similarly covered in dark energy. The players looked at what was happening with all their eyes. What was going on around them caused great fear in their hearts. The player with the eye patch with a tremor in his body could not take his eyes off that picture, for something completely unreal had begun to happen in front of him. Hundreds of slimes colored in a different hue began to rise rapidly into the air. Covering himself with his hands, the player thought that this was the real end for them. He screamed in fear and could do nothing about it. But sometime later, when still nothing happened to him, the player opened his eyes. The slimes, as he thought about to attack him, swiftly whizzed past them. The player with the helmet on his head stared in the other direction. His eyes were wide open at what he saw. But unfortunately for the players, what was happening now in the grounds was seen by all. A huge shadow of power, and slimes was growing in front of their eyes. At the same moment, notification boxes appeared in front of everyone. There was a tale of how the slimes could no longer tolerate the oppression of humans. And now they've come together to recreate a slime queen who will lead an entire race to their salvation. The slime queen let out a thunderous roar. Her scream was filled with anger and hatred for all the players in this universe. She lifted her head up and roared even harder, her arms spread apart. Trees were ripped out from the roots and fell on players in the vicinity. Only one player was able to miraculously survive such an attack. He tried to dodge the gunfire and escape from the place. At some point, the player stopped and raised his head. What he saw was too scary. His knees trembled. Compared to the monster, the player was too small. The slime queen towered over the entire hunting ground. Dex and his surname were watching from above. The guy was so dumbfounded by what he saw that he couldn't find the right words right away. Dex slowly turned his head towards Satan, whom he nicknamed Tank, and wondered what he had done. A formidable howl reached them. Even though they were at a distance, the queen's power could be felt. After the first roar, there was a second wave. The guys could barely stand on their feet. The demon was pleased with the result. He expected the slimes to create a real queen out of their hatred. Dex stared at the demon in surprise when he recognized that he had shared his decency points with the slimes. Tanchik laughed and grinned with delight. He needed very little decency to give the slimes such power. Players gathered outside the town to set up defenses. Someone shouted that the slimes were getting too close. Warriors with shields stepped forward. Within a couple of minutes, a real battle had already begun between the humans and the slimes. The slimes attacked the players, mercilessly piercing their defenses. A notification popped up in every player's town, informing them that the quest to hunt a serial assassin had been removed. To complete the task, it was necessary to protect the city of newcomers, destroy the Queen of Slimes, and not let destroy the protective crystal of the city. As the outrage of the players spread through the city, a new thunderous roar was heard. Looking up, each player's head saw a huge green girl. Dex continued to sit on the hill and watch from above what was going on near the town. Tansik hovered near him and wanted to know what the plan was. The demon moved closer to the Arnian's ear and told how the player could end this quest and destroy the newcomer city. Despite the tempting offer, Dex was in no hurry to take any action. He wished to just observe. The demon had another thought in his head. He decided that his master was a genius because he would destroy everything and the hopes of the players would be destroyed. Many notices reopened in front of Dex. The boy pondered Tanchika's words. Now Dex would have to make a difficult decision. Meanwhile, the slimes continued their bloodthirsty onslaught on the players. The humans fought desperately, and Dex, with the smirk of a true villain, continued to ponder which side he should choose. The queen's huge mouth opened again, and a loud roar erupted from it. At the same time, the developers and writers were watching everything going on in the game. They gathered in the office for a meeting. The man wasn't ready to comment on anything, so he just stared at the screen with his arms folded in a lock. The silence was broken by one of the employees who jumped up from his seat, unable to bear it any longer. Dae-hoon didn't understand how a 100th level monster could be in a place that was only for beginners. Her name was Wang Ji-hee, and she was the lead designer. Her whole appearance showed excitement about the circumstances of the game. Dae-hoon raised his voice with every word he wanted justice and to report the situation to the head office. Hearing the different opinions of the staff, Mu-yun-chang bowed his head over his tablet. The executive director began to run through in his head the chain of events that could have led to this outcome. Then came the strange serial assassin that was talked about on all the forums and the appearance of a mysterious mission to capture him. And eventually, a series of unknown events led to the appearance of a slime queen in the vicinity of Newcomer Town. Myung-chan had a lot to think about. He sat in silence for a long time, and at some point it hit him. The rest of the staff turned their faces toward the boss when he spoke. He was sure it wasn't the head office that had done it. The director gave a thumbs up and shared a guess. He's sure the events were connected to one user. This statement stunned everyone at the meeting. They found it easier to believe that the game system itself had failed. Dae-hoon bowed his head and scrolled through the chain of events once again. Now the thought of the user-voiced idea didn't seem delusional to him. Mu-yun-chang stood up and continued speaking. He looked around at the staff. If the events were due to internal decisions, the administration could not interfere in any way. Eyes lowered to the tablet on the desk. There opened the statistics. Even if the user's actions caused destruction, the policy was that they could not interfere. The newcomer city was on fire, the thick smoke rising into the sky. It seemed the destruction was too colossal. Meanwhile, the center overflowed with slimes. Players tried to confront. From all sides, flickered magical power. A middle-aged man clad in steel armor swung his axe and was able to destroy one slime ball. The warrior clenched his teeth tighter. He could only defeat one slime alone. Behind him, the player heard the characteristic sound that slimes make when attacked. The old man turned his head sharply and saw the danger. A terrible realization came to him immediately. And at the last moment, someone wedged between the old man and the monster. Slime forcefully collapsed the player's shield. The kid held back the pressure and turned to the old man and shouted loudly for cover. The old man was not cowardly, so he did not rush to his feet and ran away. After a while, the guy and the old man still managed to find a secluded corner in town. The old man crouched down and took off his helmet. Baron was the guard of the guard. He held up his hand, raised a sad, yet full of gratitude look. Hearing such words, the guy turned to the old man and gave a thumbs up. The old man continued to praise the guy, which made him too embarrassed to do so. The man asked to be tracked down as soon as it was over and wanted to share his grandfather's old journal entries. In front of the player immediately popped up a window that he was able to open a task where a secret profession was hidden. The player was very happy that he decided to help the old man, because now he had the opportunity to get a secret profession. The man raised his head and looked somewhere in the distance. He still couldn't believe that such a thing could happen in the initial city. They now had a mission far more important than the rest. The Slime Queen continued to loom over the city. 3 days of the opening mission. Wrath of the Slimes has passed in suspense. Half of the allotted time for the raid has passed. But Korean players, as it was known to all, are not used to retreat from difficulties. They were ready to fight to the last. As soon as high-level users got wind of what had happened in the newcomer's town, they immediately rushed to their aid. The rookies themselves also took decisive action. They created their own slime extermination squad and succeeded well in it. Players who make the 1000th slime kill receive the title Slime Destroyer from the game. It was a turning point in the raid. Now the players have even more hope. A frown appeared on Dex's face. The guy was still watching what was happening in the city from the hilltop. Tansik was thrilled with the mix-up. He even admitted it was the first time he'd ever seen a player as evil as Dex. The demon abruptly flew up to the guy and started slapping him on the head. This was Tanchik's way of expressing his admiration and respect. Dex went back to thinking about the situation. He realized if this hadn't happened, it would have taken months to accumulate the... Tanchik hovered in the air and folded his arms to see what his master would do next. The demon nodded toward the city and asked his host to take a closer look at the current situation. And the demon was right. People had gotten stronger during the raid. Many had already gotten statuses and were now easily defeating slimes. Dex was well aware that he was now at a crossroads. At some point, the guy's lips stretched into a snide grin. Dex opened a window with information and began to search for something in it. Tanchik watched his master's actions with curiosity, and after a few seconds, Dex covered his body with a cloak. He pulled the hood over his head, hiding his identity. As the cloak rose from the gusting wind, the demon noticed traces of blood on it and shuddered at the sight of it. Meanwhile, Dex was fully preparing himself for the time to pick a side and decide who would win this fight. Tanchik smiled. He was excited to see what the master would choose. Dex glanced at his companion, a sinister smile playing on his face. He made the decision to side with the slimes. The director came to Lee Mu-young's office. The woman sat at her desk and listened. He came to her to stop the wrath of the slimes assignment. Realizing what the consequences to the game might be, the man bowed his head and began to beg her for it. The woman was Mu-young's boss, raised her head toward Myung-chan. From the expression on her face, it was hard to guess what she was thinking about right now. The players were given 7 days to complete the task. On the one hand, it seemed to be enough, but on the other hand, it was not enough. But it was coming to an end. With only 10 minutes left in the raid, the players hoped they could defend their city. The players were discussing their chances of winning. The slimes in the city had too few left, and all these days, they had never managed to break through the defense line. The guy firmly clenched his fist, confident that the players would succeed because there wasn't much time left, and the slimes had really gone quiet. But in an instant, everything changed. The sky turned scarlet, and there was an oppressive silence. Standing on the Slime Queen's head was Dex. He decided it was his time to get in the middle of this fight and change the course of it. The player demanded that they stay calm because time was about to run out, and then they would complete the assignment. Needless panic in this situation was unnecessary. But this player's face changed dramatically when he heard a strange and oppressive sound behind him. The guy unconsciously yelped. Baron looked beyond the wall. He clearly saw the queen begin to approach the huge creature, bringing cold terror to the townspeople. The queen did indeed approach and rose above the city. People watched as a bright glow began to burst from her chest. Arching her back, the Slime Queen made her strike. She let out a piercing scream, and a beam of light burst from her chest. The players listened in horror to these terrifying sounds. The ground and walls around shook from the waves that came from the demon queen. The queen lowered her jelly hands to the wall and reached forward. The monster's eyes burned with hatred. With only 9 minutes left to complete the task, the players already realized that this could be enough time for the city to fall. The Queen of Smiles put her hands through the wall and lowered them to the ground. This action produced a strong tremor, reminiscent of an earthquake. Her hands turned into a slimy substance, and a new army of slimes began to burst out of them into the city. Finding no better solution, the weapons were thrown to the ground. A loud clang of thrown weapons was heard from all sides. Some fell to the ground, some sharply turned around, leaving their comrades and ran. Panic came in waves and swept away all the courage of the heroes. The guy looked at the fleeing players and could not believe his eyes. He was going to stand in defense to the last and would not give up on this mission. But when there's no one left around, the valiant hero is left with a big problem of his own. A dark shadow appeared over the player, his head back and his mouth opened wide. Eventually, the player was covered in slime with no way to get out of it. The queen's hand crashed into the ground and a new flood entered the city. Suddenly, an attack was launched at the Queen of Smiles. The monster managed to deflect, but part of her shoulder was hit. A player with bright red hair appeared on the battlefield. He shouted at the top of his voice, urging the other players to listen to him. From such a surprise, the players froze on the spot and looked at the brave player who managed to attack the Slime Queen. The guy put his sword on his shoulder and leaned on his knee and continued shouting. He urged to pull himself together and hold on for the remaining 5 minutes. The boys continued to listen to the speech, and everyone found truth in it. The players' dropped spirits began to rise back up. The players began to exchange brief nods. Their faces became more confident, and the mood lifted upward. And a moment later, all the players raised their weapons upward and let out a battle chant. The red-haired guy on the rooftop with the 2 girls was very pleased that he was able to boost morale. The guy was all set to win and wasn't going to be discouraged. He suggested that all players hit the monster, and it didn't matter if they did damage. The men, invigorated by the call, went to the front lines and were ready to do their best to withstand this battle. With less than a minute to go, the Slime Queen was releasing more and more slime that was infiltrating the city. Players attacked her arrows, flew from all directions, and stuck in the head of the queen. Such a monster did not feel the attacks on itself. There were only 8 seconds left before the end of the raid. The action started happening too fast. The monster was furious. At the 7th second, the red-haired guy called out to the queen. He was waiting for the right moment to make his strike on the monster. Intercepting the sword, the player unleashed the force. A wave from his energy spread the guy's hair in different directions. At the 5th second, the player took off at speed toward the queen. In the 4th second, the player tried to make his attack on the queen, but it failed. No one expected the monster to have a shield. 3 seconds left to go, player was not upset that he failed to break through the defense. With 2 seconds to go, the Slime Queen was clearly feeling the failure. She had been cruelly cheated, and now she could lose this battle. Muyong Chang was silent. He hoped for the favor of his superior and was afraid to say anything right now. Muyong covered her beautiful eyes and sighed heavily. She understood the executive director's intentions. The man lowered his gaze and once again announced that he was requesting that this assignment be terminated. The woman, rising from her desk, repeated the words she had said to him before this conversation. She straightened up and reminded him once again of their company policy. They were not gods. Muyong began to walk slowly around her desk. The executive director carefully happened upon her bosses. Tired after the battle, the red-haired player sat down on the edge of the fountain, exactly where the protective crystal was kept. Raising his head, he quietly began to chuckle, feeling the moment of victory in this difficult and tricky task. And at that very moment, the defense crystal emitted a cracking sound. A cracking sound went off along its body. The glowing particles were flying in different directions. The player froze. His heart thumped in his chest. Dex stood with his sword stuck into the protective crystal of the newcomer city. In addition to preventing the players from winning this assignment, Dex mocked them. Notifications began to appear that the newcomer city had been permanently destroyed. The player simply could not believe that this was actually happening. After the blade came down on the player who lunged at Dex, screaming the guy didn't get any decency points for it. The other players ran to the center of town. They couldn't believe the crystal had been destroyed. Once they ran out into the central square, so abruptly slowed down, they didn't expect to see a man in the place where the crystal had been. Dex continued to stand triumphantly in place. Where the crystal had recently stood, there was a void. The players continued to stare in horror at the black-cloaked stranger. The maddened players couldn't contain their anger and started unleashing it on the guy. They screamed at him and threatened to kill him. Dex only turned his head in their direction, and a slight smile curved his lips. Players are furious. They thought that this creep should be caught, and his nickname should be found out, and everything should be done so that he can no longer play normally. But it was impossible to break Dex with such threats. He continued to stand his ground fearlessly and grinned. Dex's equanimity did not go unnoticed. The player stopped abruptly, sensing a dark aura emanating from the stranger. While everyone was busy bemoaning the failure of the raid, something happened over the city. A bright flash lit up the sky. The players raised their heads up and watched with bated breath the strange phenomenon. The flash began to shrink in size, and a green cast appeared around it. Loud screams began to echo through the streets of the city. The players looked at the ground and some sort of slime began to seep out of it. Players noticed that the slime was rising upwards and gathering into a single clot. This phenomenon alarmed everyone very much. The conversation was interrupted by another bright flash coming from underground. When the light faded a bit, the player opened his eyes. The green slime was still rising around him. Where there was a bright flash, slimes formed, but this time they were huge. The slimes have spent a long time under the oppression of mankind, and yet they still managed to fight back against their abuser in a fierce battle. The slimes have taken over lands that once belonged to mankind and are ruled by their beautiful queen. Dex folded his arms across his chest and whistled when he saw the slime queen in her new form. From that moment on, when the defense crystal was destroyed, the newcomer city was completely taken over by the slimes. The fact that the city no longer belonged to the players was reported in pop-up windows. Now, everyone who entered this city was notified that the recommended level was above 80. Behind the player, a distinctive sound was heard. His whole body twitched, and the guy started to turn his head slowly. But it was too late. Huge slimes surrounded the players. Dex continued to watch the city change and smiled. He was incredibly pleased with this turn of events. The slimes started attacking players who were not leveled for this city. Mikan was a gaming news anchor for TVG channel. The girl dressed in cosplay and spoke in a very cartoonish voice. And of course, all the girl's attention was around the game Arcadia. She told about the incredible popularity among players. Jae-yoon was still lying in bed, and in the background a computer was running with news broadcasts. As difficult as it was to get out of bed, he still forced himself to. Even in the bathroom, Jae-yoon continued to listen to the news from Mikan. The girl was shocked by the recent events. Meanwhile, the guy had already had time to wash his face and wash his hair. The girl finished the short issue and said goodbye. Thousands of posts sprinkled across the forum afterwards. Some didn't believe it had actually happened. Holding his phone in his hand and continuing to read the many angry comments, Jae-yoon was busy brushing his teeth. Even while rinsing his mouth, the guy couldn't quiet his thoughts. It's not his fault that the game gave him the hidden class of Bard of Anarchy. It's not like the game's mechanics were originally designed for such a process. It's also not his fault that the game gave him a demon surname as a mid-gift. But there was also a mysterious guy who, at the beginning of Dex's journey, told him about the power he would now have. Thoughts swirled around in Jae-yoon's mind, and he didn't realize how deep he had fallen into them himself. But after a minute, it was as if the guy had shaken the hardships off his head and thought that the worst-case scenario was that he'd just be blocked. It was more important to focus on the important things rather than worry about the possible consequences. The sun was already shining brightly outside the window. The city was in its usual hustle and bustle. Some were in a hurry to work, others to study. Everyone had their own worries. For Jae-yoon, the school year had started, and he was happy about it. He was happy to go to his classes. His gaze turned interestedly to the student sitting beside him. Something trembled in the boy's soul at that moment. The student was looking very intently at his phone, but more important was what video was being shown at that moment. The guy's phone had the exact video of Dex's player being on the Slime Queen's head. Jae-yoon was shocked to see himself in the video. He didn't know at what point he was filmed. His eyes lowered, and he cringed when he saw that the video had over 2 million views. Feeling a stare, the student turned his head. Jae-yoon awkwardly raised his eyes to the guy. When the student suggested that he watch the video together, Jae-yoon chuckled nervously. The student extended his hand and introduced himself as Lim Jae-young. He smiled at Jae-yoon and was happy to make a new acquaintance. This sudden friendliness made Jae-yoon tense. He slightly stammered as he introduced himself between the two, struck up a conversation. The unsuspecting student began to tell in all colors. He was shocked. Weak monsters were able to gain strength and take over an entire location. After a silence, Jae-young spoke, but it seemed as if his voice had changed. The student wanted to know if his acquaintance had heard anything about the serial assassin. Jae-yoon's insides turned cold and many thoughts rushed through his mind. Looking at the student's sharp gaze, Jae-yoon wondered if he had guessed that the real assassin was sitting in front of him right now. The tablet was playing a video showing the newcomer city, which was changed when humanity lost to the monsters. Mu-young held the tablet in her hand and sighed heavily. Newcomer city was truly destroyed. The woman sipped her hot coffee and gravely continued to think. In spite of all the problems that arose because of this assignment, the game was only talked about. It was a big plus for their popularity. Opening her eyes, she grinned. After all, this was all the work of one user. The woman realized she really wanted to know about this player. The hand sharply reached toward Jae-yoon, scaring the guy. He'd be in a lot of trouble if someone guessed who he really was. The atmosphere immediately changed and became friendly. Jae-young, with a smile on his face, began to promote himself as the best expert. A student showed a video of Dex while talking non-stop about Assassin. Jae-young noticed his new friend's interest and continued to vigorously describe the events that had occurred. In fact, Jae-yoon didn't like that this guy had guessed too many things. Noticing the pensive and tense face of Jae-yoon, the student paused slightly and bit his tongue. Meanwhile, a lecture on computer engineering began. A professor entered the auditorium and stood behind his chair. The man introduced himself as Kim Dae-hoon. He wasn't just a professor, he was also the head of the computer engineering department. Some students began to look around in incomprehension. They had obviously expected a more welcoming address. Kim Dae-hoon raised his head and continued speaking. His face was serious about the topic he was about to address. And not surprisingly, the talk was about the all-famous Arcadia game. Jae-yoon tensed up slightly. The man continued. He was very concerned that those who had experienced the virtual reality with their bodies were well aware that engineering would no longer be enough to fill the needs of real time and to be more modern. For the students, it was indeed shocking news. Folding his hands in a lock, Jae-yoon listened attentively and was in complete agreement with his statement. With each word, the professor tensed more and more. He wanted to convey the importance of the thought to each student. 1 second, and the professor declares that the name of the department has been changed to Virtual Reality Engineering. Kim Dae-hoon took the microphone and his voice became even louder and clearer. He realized that such news would confuse many people. When the lecture was over, the students went to the cafeteria to get something to eat. Each carried his tray and looked for a seat. Jae-young was shocked that the name of an entire specialty had now changed. For all his surprise, Jae-young was also delighted with the professor himself, who had mentioned Arcadia during the lecture. When a new question came in, a meatball fell out of Yoon's mouth in surprise. He wanted to know why he wasn't playing Arcadia. Jae-yoon had to lie very quickly about how he couldn't afford the capsule, but the student was happy to tell us that he loves to play and spends a lot of time doing it. Then he put his hands on his chest and bragged about having a pretty good character, with a pretty good level. Jae-young went on to say convincingly that if a friend wanted to play someday, he would be happy to help him pump up the game. At some point, Jae-yoon realized that in front of him sat a very kind and cheerful guy. A slight grin touched his lips. Dex was greeted by a disgruntled Tanchik, who scolded the player for taking so long to log in. Dex didn't really care about Tanchik's anger. The raid had kept him up for days. Tanchik still continued to pant with indignation and showed it with all his appearance. There was an exclamation that only a slime could make. Dex immediately turned at the sound. The guy did not even have time to do anything, as in his arms was the queen of the slimes. The girl was very happy. A second later, about a dozen cheerful and peaceful slimes pounced on the player. They all piled him on the ground and squeezed him from all sides. Even Tunchi got a little love, but the demon lord wasn't happy about it. After a while, the tenderness stopped, and the guys were released from the big love slime. The queen bowed her knee to Dex. This was her way of expressing her gratitude. The slime race will never forget this. Dex's status changed from slime friend to slime savior. A crown appeared in the air and hung over the player's head. Plus, the player was rewarded with additional decency points for completing the task. His physical strength and skills were also increased. He nodded. So little time had passed since he started playing, and he had many statuses. Tanchika's voice sounded, and Dex turned his head toward him. Putting his hands in his pockets and wearing a disgruntled grimace, Tanchik demanded to go on his way. The purple already made his eyes blurry. Dex couldn't agree with the statement and would have been glad to get out of this place sooner himself. The Slime Queen looked very happy. She cheerfully waved goodbye to the departing slime savior. Dex felt a thrill of anxiety in his chest as a whole world of mystery and adventure was now opening up before him. Far away in the mountains spread a city. It was much larger than the newcomer city and certainly had more possibilities. And there was associated with this city a mysterious girl around whom everything shone. Barony of Michaeltown, which was located 10 kilometers from the town of newcomers. This place was recommended for newcomer players. Rumors about the city spread too quickly, and soon a lot of players began to flock to the lands of Michael. Entrance to the barony was through the center gate. 4 guards stood with pikes in their hands and inspected everyone. Dex was no exception. And as he approached the entrance, one of the guards stopped him abruptly and demanded to be named. The player with the innocent face quickly introduced himself. He didn't want to get in trouble. In his hood sat Tanchik. The guard blocked the guy's path with his pike and continued his questioning. Dex nodded when he asked if he came from the newcomer town. The guard immediately changed his face. He didn't understand what could have happened in the city that many people had arrived in the barony. It was amazing to Dex that in this game, even NPS could exchange news and rumors. The guard shocked at the information Dex had told him. Now the level for the newcomer city was 85. Dex was overjoyed when the guard started to issue him a pass. Now the guy can visit the city unhindered. Dex noticed this and decided to find out what was wrong. The Lord scratched the back of his head. He didn't know what feeling was playing in his chest. The player was even more interested in this, but the demon waved it off and assured him that it wasn't that important. The demon's mood changed, and with a hand on his hip, he decided to find out why Dex kept calling him Tanchik. Dex looked at his companion and assured him that if he called him Satan, it would draw attention to him. When he heard the explanation, Tanchik immediately became proud. Tanchika's scarlet eyes flashed toward Dex. He was curious as to what his master was going to do next. Dex looked down at his glasses of integrity because that's what it was all about. He didn't know how he was going to use them yet. And after the demon again offered Dex to share the decency points with him, the player immediately shook his head in agreement. Hearing such a categorical statement, Tanchik howled with indignation. According to the demon, Dex will not be able to spend these points on his own. The demon lord immediately began describing all the various premium items he could share, but Dex wasn't tempted by that prospect. The guy was adamant that he'd use Tanchik's services when the time came. Nevertheless, the demon managed to snag the player's interest, but he won't show it. The demon showed him the object of the 150th. The guy was thinking that the points of decency might be far more valuable than he realizes. That seemed like the right course of action to Dex. He wasn't going to rush into anything, because there was so much more to come. And what stopped him the most was the fact that the ease of acquiring items could make him lose interest in the game. Dex entered the city and was immediately immersed in its flavor. The streets were filled with merchants soliciting shoppers in every way possible. Tanchik watched his master curiously and wanted to know his plan of action. Dex's eyes slowly circled the city. At some point, the guy went to a tavern. 2 men were sitting at a table, talking about something depressingly. One of the men bowed his head and clenched his fists to complain about the mistress's orders. The other man folded his arms across his chest and leaned back on the bench. He sighed heavily and nodded understandingly. Dex stood back and realized from this conversation that Baroness Michael was the mistress of the land. And there's a problem with ore mining. The player sharply jumped with laughter at the sound that frightened Tanchik, but his master was excited. The fleeting information he had just heard sounded very promising to the lad. The demon lord was shocked by his master's mood swings, but Tanchik himself didn't notice a thing. The men looked up sharply when someone called out to them. Dex, with a bright smile, confidently announced that he knew the solution to the problem. The men immediately brightened with excitement. They were very happy to meet such a guy who could help them. Dex was pleased to have found the mission. It said that the player needed to help the miners and produce 20 units of ore. The player advised his companion to look around and listen to what other people were talking about. The streets of the city were filled with shouts of traders buying up iron ore. They were willing to pay good money for the resource. Nevertheless, for Tanchik, there was nothing unusual in all this. The companion only shrugged his shoulders. The demand for weapons has increased greatly due to the large influx of newcomers to the city. Most players rejected the ore gathering task. As Tanchik pointed out, it was too easy. Listening to his master, the demon still hadn't gotten to the truth. Tanchik arched an eyebrow and looked at him, waiting for further explanation. Dex walked past the demon with a slight smile on his lips. He wished the demon would guess for himself what might happen in such a case. Then Dex turned to the demon and showed the OK sign. For starters, the guy wanted to make some money. The baroness sat at her desk, reading the financial reports with a worried look on her face. Iron ore last month was worth 10 bronze, but this month the price jumped dramatically, and it was now valued at 15 coins. She realized that because of the lack of raw materials, the blacksmith's work could deteriorate in quality, and the price would only increase. In the highlands on Mount Fianna was the entrance to mine number 1. Dex went in deep. He didn't want to meet any other players. He looked around and smiled because he could act. The matter was now placed in the hands of Tanchik. He looked doubtfully at his master, for he was not sure of the correctness of the... Dex once again assured his companion that he knew what he was doing. He really was willing to spend a little integrity for the sake of one item. With a loud chuckle and a disgruntled look, the demon raised his hand. If the master demanded something he could not resist. For 8,000 decency, the demon summoned a mine destroyer drill for the host. Dex looked longingly at his new acquisition. The guy was already anticipating riches. Meanwhile, the marketplace was bustling with commerce. Merchants were offering their weapons. Players were admiringly looking at the... There were a variety of weapons on sale, but the best sellers were light swords. The player examined one of the weapons with attention. The girl stood in the square and shouted that she was willing to buy 20 units of iron ore to complete the mission. The girl was approached by another player and asked her what kind of mission she wanted to buy ore for. Then the player told her that this assignment would not help her in her development, because by doing it, she could only get a reputation boost. The player said goodbye, but before leaving, the guy advised the girl to mine the ore and sell it to traders for more profit. The blacksmiths, Aiden and Kashim, became unwilling witnesses to the conversation. Their faces contorted with anger. Kashim was very unhappy with the situation. Adventurers were buying up all the ore and creating their weapons. The blacksmith's patience was about to run out. Aiden was sure that if the baroness didn't do something about it, there would be trouble. The economy in Arcadia mimicked the real production, and consumption was the main part of it. Each region specialized in a different type of raw material. Some regions dealt with ore, others with leather, others with wool. Depending on the season, the demand for certain resources rose or fell between regions, and there was trade or an equal exchange of resources between regions. By far the most sought-after resource was iron ore. The player was ready to be hysterical with despair. The guy didn't think it would be so difficult to get iron ore. His girlfriend nodded in agreement. Iron was now in short supply, as many around him had chosen to become blacksmiths. The constant shortage of iron ore on the market has caused the price per piece to rise from 10 bronze to 17 coins. The increased price of iron created a new problem for blacksmiths. They began to incur losses because no one wanted to buy the weapons that had increased in price. The girl raised her head with her arms at her sides and said grudgingly that this was too much. She didn't like realistic politics. They both turned their heads and looked at the one who had decided to intervene in their conversation. He looked at the players and wanted to know why they wouldn't go mining. Hearing this question, the guys sighed heavily. They already knew what difficulties could stand in the way of this action and did not even consider such an option. Just getting from the town to the mine could take about 2 hours, and just getting there took too long. But that was not the main reason. The process itself was not easy, and the player could run out of durability at any time. The guys hovered over the kid, sharing their observations. It was easier for them to buy ore and work on improving their skills and professions. And finally, they reminded the kid once again that digging in the mine was a very unprofitable endeavor. But now, there was a player in the mine who didn't think that mining ore might not be a profitable investment of time. Dex stopped and wiped his forehead as signs began to pop up in front of him about how much ore he had mined. Looking through his inventory, Dex decided that the ore he'd mined would be enough. He was pleased with the result. Dex and Tanchik split up for the mining season. The demon flew into the tunnel where his master was and was glad to meet him. Tanchik swooped down on his master with a new offer. His eyes shone when he talked about the drill being even better than it was now. Without waiting for Dex's response, the demon continued to advertise his merchandise. A magic circle appeared behind his back. For the remnants of Dex's decency, the demon was willing to give him the Tears of Darkness necklace. This item was good for increasing the speed of ore mining, but the player was unimpressed with the subject. The guy wiped his face clean of dirt. In addition, this item could only be worn by a player after gaining level 220. Dex didn't see the point of it. Dex's face grew more menacing. He couldn't even sell the item because everyone would know who he was. All these arguments were like arrows piercing the demon's body. His master turned out to be quite clever. When this conversation was over and the demon had calmed down, Dex wondered where he had been disappearing. Tanchik sat down on a tunnel stone and slipperily evaded the answer. Dex still insisted Tanchik's face changed immediately. The demon's eyes reddened and flashed. He looked at his master ominously. But Dex only got a snide laugh from the demon. In response, he promised that he would only tell his master when he found what he was looking for. The demon looked at Dex's open inventory. When he saw how much ore he had collected, Tanchik nodded approvingly. Dex was glad to hear that, so he decided he'd stay in the mine for a couple more days to get more ore. The guy stopped and thought about the fact that he could get a lot of friendship points for completing the task repeatedly. The baroness called a meeting of her closest people. She sat with her arms folded and looked at a dozen letters from blacksmiths, complaining about the lack of ore. Things were bad. Some were ready to leave the barony. The girl felt the strong pressure of the people and could not do anything. In order to understand the problem, it was necessary to determine what caused it. Baroness raised her head and addressed the gentleman. The other man, actively gesturing with his hands, was in full agreement. The adventurers had no experience in blacksmithing. The Baroness's eyes narrowed. She noted the fact that there had been no more miners in the meantime. The girl wanted to know if they could force the adventurers to start mining the ore. Then the lawyer spoke. His words did not please the Baroness. She started sketching out various options to get out of the situation, but they were all dismissed by the lawyer. The doors of the hall where the meeting was being held opened very abruptly. A guard ran into the hall. The girl looked up in bewilderment. The guardian informed her that she was urgently needed elsewhere. In the middle of the street, there was a high hill with iron ore players and game NPCs circled around, not understanding where this could have come from. The Baroness looked at the mountain in utter confusion. The girl had no idea who had left such wealth here and why. Meanwhile, Dex found a secluded spot in the alleyways of the city and sat down on wooden crates to calculate his income from the ore he had sold. Pouring a handful of coins into the palm of his hand, the guy summarized that in 3 days, he was able to earn 5 gold coins and 12 silver coins. In his mind, he figured out how much money he could make in the real world. Dex was sure he could make a lot more money, but he had to make a plan. A woman's voice brought him out of his musings. In front of him stood the Baroness herself. The girl looked at the mysterious player with interest. Dex looked up in time to read the notification that the Baroness was expressing favor with him. The girl with a smile on her face introduced herself to the player and told him that she was the mistress of this barony. Looking at each other, Dex waited for the Baroness to make her next move, and after a moment, she offered to have a cup of tea together. After a while, Dex and the Baroness sat down in the cushioned armchairs. There was already hot tea on the table. The Baroness offered the player a taste of the tea that was being collected at Mount Fiangai, took the cup, and sipped a small sip. When the pleasantries were over, the Baroness could no longer restrain her curiosity. The girl wanted to know how long it had taken to get that much ore. Dex raised his head and replied casually that he'd spent no more than 3 days on it. She forgot her manners and jumped up from the table and wanted to know how it was possible. The girl came to her senses very quickly and calmly returned to her seat. She could not allow herself such liberties. Dex's answer didn't comfort her, and even when the guy offered to round up a good number of players, Dex twitched when the Baroness turned to him and earnestly asked for help. With a hopeful look on her face, the girl began to talk about the problems that came from the influx of adventurers. Dex has been waiting for this moment. He's been given the choice to take the assignment or not. Their conversation came to the point where the Baroness asked the player to get the adventurers to work in the mine. Dex lifted his head with a noble smile and put his hand to his chest and assured Baroness that he would do just fine. Late at night, Jae-yoon left the game world and returned to the real world. The guy sat down at his computer and scrolled through the game's forum. Although he assured the Baroness that he would, the reality was more complicated. Continuing to flip through the game forum, a snide smirk played across the guy's face. At Seoul High School, a sad student was approached by a classmate in one of his classes. The guy wanted to know if his friend would go to play today. Choi Hyun. Tak looked up at his classmate with a sad look and a depressed mood. He didn't want to say it, and yet the schoolboy admitted that he had abandoned the game. His classmate looked at Hentak Arcadia with complete bewilderment. He thought it was a very strange game to him. The classmate felt bad about it because he had already made it farther in the game and hadn't caught such disappointment. Hyeon Tak could barely get out of that scary city that the slimes took over. The classmate scratched the back of his head as Hentak was able to move to the barony and was even able to change his class to merchant class. Because there were not many professions in the barony, he chose a merchant. The schoolboy gained some skills, but among them was not an attacker. A classmate realized that his friend has completely fallen in spirit, because now, because of a large series of failures, he has lost any desire to play in Arcadia. The next words interested the lad. He looked at him with sad eyes, hoping that he would provide him with a solution. And then the classmate showed Hyun-tak his phone with a confident finger poking at the screen. The video began with a greeting and a story about where the player was now, namely inside Mount Fian at the entrance to the first mine. Guys watched this video with bated breath because some player decided to share with the world how easy it is to make money on mining ore. The player also voiced the thoughts of a schoolboy who was not sure of the reality of the work, but the opened bag with money very attracted his viewer. Of course, it had a great effect. Hyung-tak couldn't get away from the video. Then came some facts that the player began to explain on his fingers. At first, for any starting player, the prospects did not seem very attractive. Therefore, the player assured the audience to develop the miner's skill rank. Next, a precious crystal appeared in the player's hand. He continued to narrate. This information completely blew the schoolboy's mind. He looked at ore mining with a different eye. Then the player decided to skip the moment of mining itself. It was boring, and the next frame showed us a blacksmith. By taking out the coins, the player demonstrated his earnings in 1 day. The schoolboy's eyes glistened, and coins were already pouring into his head. Hentak had already fully seen himself as a professional miner. The player's channel has gained incredible popularity, but no one knew that the author of this video about many nuances remained silent. The video left out crucial nuances and made it seem like literally anyone can get great results. At one point, the players seemed to go crazy. They pounced on every counter and demanded to be sold a pickaxe. Players dressed in full armor one by one like faceless puppets went to Mount Fianna to get gold. Such news incredibly pleased Baroness Michael. The girl just laughed with happiness. Dex sat in a soft chair and folded his arms across his chest. He was pleased to see the Baroness in such a mood. Still, the girl was very curious to know something, and what such basic needs this mysterious player was talking about. Then Dex smiled even wider, because the desire for easy money did wonders for people. The Baroness, though she didn't understand how he'd achieved such a result, was still very happy about it. Then Dex decided to remind her. Dex's face immediately became more composed and serious as he brought them back to the important details of this plan. The Baroness nodded because, thanks to Dex, that's exactly what she would do. Such advice immediately showed Dex the Baroness's inexperience in economics. The boy grinned, for he could teach her how it was done in reality. The Baroness also became more serious when she spoke of the increased cost of iron ore. It wasn't hard for Dex to give the Baroness some advice on the matter as well. Guy suggested not paying attention to the price increase. The player thought about what they would do if they started complaining. The girl immediately tensed up, but Dex decided it wasn't worth paying much attention to them either. The Baroness could not be pleased to make such a pleasant acquaintance with this enigmatic player. When Dex reminded her that he was first and foremost a player, the Baroness came to her senses again and coughed. Behind all these hints and hints, there was a motive lurking in the lad's soul. As if reading the player's thoughts, the Baroness, with eyes full of happiness, offered the player to thank him. A scroll tied with a golden ribbon and bearing a red seal fell on the table. She was in no hurry to unwrap it. The Baroness took the scroll in her hand and first asked the player what the scroll was about. Dex said in a completely calm voice that it was his business proposition for the Baroness. A slight smile played on his lips. The guy promised the girl that she'd like what was written in the scroll. One person in the game could make a limited amount of money, so Dex had to do some thinking. In the player's mind, it was simple. All it took was to gain power over others and lead the food chain. The girl's eyes opened wide as she read what was written in the scroll. She couldn't believe that someone would offer her something like this. Dex saw the Baroness's interest in her proposal. Putting a finger to his lips, the player spoke. Several thousand years ago, a great battle broke out between angels and demons. The sky was covered with black clouds, and lava was flowing down the walls of the volcano. Lightning struck between the two opponents. They were sworn enemies belonging to completely different races. The angel in golden radiance and the demon shrouded in darkness swept through each other, striking a decisive blow. Satan, the Lord of Chaos, the demon lord, looked up at the archangel with hatred. The angel towered over her worst enemy, holding a sacred spear in her hands. Archangel Michael looked up at the demon with her bright blue eyes. The archangel's power was so strong that Satan fell to the ground in terror. Tanchik opened his eyes abruptly. His heart was beating a frantic rhythm. The demon was on his master's shoulder as he walked down the crowded streets of the barony. Tanchik realized that he was only dreaming, but it was far too realistic. This dream gave him the opportunity to recall something not so pleasant. Dex walked down the city street and heard people calling groups to go to the mine. Tanchik called out to his master and inquired about the scroll he had given to the Baroness. But Dex was pleased with such interest from the demon. The guy's eyes lit up with excitement. With a thumbs up, the player began to tell the demon the intricacies of ore mining. The unique ore that Dex sometimes gets is only available to him because of the drill the demon gave him, folding his arms across his chest. Tanchik was surprised when Dex reported that even in a place like this, it was actually possible to make a buck. That's when Dex revealed his plan and that secret list. Then Dex said that even those without money could enter the mine and pay later. Tanchik was shocked and wondered how much Dex would charge for entry. Dex bowed his head in thought. He knew that people were not stupid and would quickly realize that it was all a total scam. Satan himself was shocked at the audacity of this player. Assigning such an amount was true sacrilege. The demon wasn't sure if the stupidity of the players was enough to charge him such sums, but Dex only grinned. Eyes glazed over with anticipation of real fun. His plan would work, and he could get some very easy money. Tanchik couldn't believe his eyes and ears. If he wasn't a demon ruler himself, he could surely give that title to Dex. Dumbfounded by such audacity of the master, Tanchik bowed his head. With such ease to fool people, could only a real villain. Dex lifted his head and looked at the demon. He turned to him questioningly, and he nodded affirmatively. Tanchik grinned and put his hand to his chest, asking his master to follow him. He wished to show Dex something very interesting. Dex didn't have the slightest clue as to what it could be. From a demon ruler, of course, you could expect anything. Eventually they descended deep into the mines, and the demon led Dex to a high and locked gateway. Dex wanted to find out what this place was. Tanchik said he'd been here a long time ago, and while Dex was mining for ore, he was able to find the gate. Dex looked around the gate and noted that it looked quite old and abandoned, most likely not having been entered in years. His eyebrows drew together. As his gaze traveled over the iron plates that hadn't rusted in so long, Dex figured the gate had a spell on it. At the same time, Tanchik was encouraging his master to try to open the gate. He was pointing his finger in the direction of the gate with a smirk on his face. Dex gave the demon a surprised and puzzled look and couldn't see how he could do it at all. The demon's insistent stare and the player's own interest of the player himself gave a slack Dex's arm, stretched forward, and approached the gateway. Dex's attempt failed. The game immediately informed him of the powerful lock that bound the gate. He already knew Dex couldn't open the gate, and that's why he brought him here. Dex shrugged. He reminded his companion that he had no skill at breaking seals. The player's words made Tanchik even angrier. His face twisted with anger, and the demon only now realized that Dex really didn't know anything about his power. The demon's anger emanated from him. He sat down defiantly in the air, folded his arms across his chest, and turned away. Tanchik once again asked his host what he knew about his power. Dex assumed he was now talking about decency. The demon decided to tell Dex about the power he had. Satan's one finger lit up in a dark flame, and his gaze focused on his master. The power Dex held in his hands could do wonders. The demon was directly telling the player that with that power, he could do whatever he wanted. But after a second, he looked at the demon with rounded eyes and admitted that he didn't fully understand it all. And then Tanchik just exploded with emotion. Looking at his clever master, he could not understand why to the player did not reach. After 10 minutes of discussion, Dex realized something. The integrity the guy had was what entities like Tanchik needed. The demon also had this power, but very, very slowly. It would have taken him about 500 years. They returned to the gate. The demon said the angels had made sure no one could enter. Tanchik looked at his master with excitement. He was confident in the player's strength, recalling that he had a powerful force. For Dex, such confidence from the demon had weighty implications. The guy really knew no bounds. Tanchik's lips spread into an even more sinister grin, revealing small, sharp teeth. All that was left was to try and do it again. Dex's hand reached toward the door again. Dex touched the gate with the clear intention of opening it, and this time, a circle appeared between the boy and the gate. At first, the player was extremely surprised that he would have to pay as much as 15,000 decency points to open the gate. The system reported that the seal had been broken, and the guys had discovered an unidentified celestial altar. The gate was no longer a barrier to the player. Dex saw what lay behind its weight. At the time of the great battle between angels and demons, the lands of Arcadia became a battleground for higher beings, and soon enough, the entire continent was colored scarlet. But there was a world tree in Arcadia, and if it weren't for its protection, nothing living could have survived. A millennium has passed since then, but the echo of the horror of the great battle still echoes in the hearts of the people of Arcadia. The game administration reconvened the meeting. They had a new problem, and sitting in the meeting room, a red error was flashing on the screen. Dae-hoon prepared to open the emergency meeting. Lowering his eyes into the sheet, the man warned everyone that this was a matter of the utmost importance. Everyone was exhausted and had yet to mentally recover from the not-so-long-ago unleashed slime problem. One by one, employees complained of fatigue as they had been up for days dealing with the city. Dae-hoon got down to business and said that the trigger for the mystic quest had been hit. After checking all the quests, he found out it was related to something in Mount Fian. Everyone lowered their eyes and began to study the materials he had collected. Muen Chang noticed that Mount Fian was also an angel's domain. This was a revelation to the managing director. Dae-hoon nodded his head because no one knew about it before today's incident. He covered his eyes and prepared to tell the story. One day, the angels first descended from heaven to Mount Fian, and since then, this place has been called the Stairway to Heaven. The abundance of ore was meant to somehow protect the stairs from intruders. The executive didn't expect that this game could have so many mysteries and mysterious plot twists. Dae-hoon opened his mouth to tell everyone the task. The man tried to start from afar in order to prepare everyone. Muyung-chan was skewered as soon as he heard the name of the quest, the second great battle of angels and demons. Dex was staring at the altar that was in this room. He realized that this place was called the Stairway to Heaven. Satan was overjoyed. He circled around his master and kept saying that he had fulfilled his promise. The demon glanced at Dex and began to cheerfully urge him to beat the angels to the punch. Slowly, the boy began to walk up the aisle. His footsteps echoed around the room. 7. Standing over the sarcophagus, Dex scrutinized it once more. Tanchik assured his master that there was a treasure inside the sarcophagus. Dex reached out his hand toward the cover. At first, he got an error that he couldn't read the ancient text. For a while, Dex was in deep thought. Doubts hovered around him. The player didn't know if he should continue to explore this place. Tanchik was losing patience and insisted that Dex open the lid sooner rather than later. There was silence. For the player to make a decision was extremely difficult, but the story that Tanchik told him was very helpful. At the same time, Baroness Michael gave a loud hiccup. She looked up thoughtfully, never knowing that at that moment, Dex had made a decision for himself. A smirk appeared on Dex's face. He's going to open that sarcophagus right now, so he shared his plan with Tanchik right away. Satan was incredibly happy that his master had made a decision. Of course, the demon had his own motives and was ready to incite in every possible way. It had been 10 minutes since their futile attempts to open the lid. Dex had been trying to pull with all his strength. Dex hadn't expected this, but Tunchi was suffering because he couldn't get his old self back. For Satan to meet such an obstacle was humiliating. As soon as Dex heard Tanchik's whiplash about the stone lid, the player was electrocuted. A brilliant idea popped into his head. Dex decided to see if there was anything of value in there. The evil demon looked at his master and convinced him that there was something extraordinary under the lid. The solution to this problem came of its own accord. Dex no longer hesitated in his actions. And a second later, stretching his arm forward in front of him, was the drill he'd been given by Tanchik to mine iron ore. Tanchik looked at his master puzzled and couldn't believe that he had come up with such a plan. Dex shrugged his shoulders, holding the drill in his hands. Dex planted his foot on the lid of the sarcophagus, the drill in his hands glowing with a bright purple light. The smile on the player's face was shining brightly. Once again, Satan looked at his master who had come up with another plan and was convinced that humans were far worse than demons. As soon as the cover was destroyed, Dex had a lot of notice. Now to the Celestials, the guy was a villain. When the sarcophagus had no lid, they saw the contents of the coffin. There lay a skeleton, dressed in white and gold embroidered robes. Realizing that Dex had opened someone's coffin really stressed him out. The guy turned and scolded the demon for not warning him. Now that there was no turning back, the demon raised his hand and pointed his finger at the necklace. There was a very interesting necklace on the dead man's chest. It was made of solid gold. The demon felt a sense of triumphant triumph. It was this amulet that the angels had saved for the future. As soon as Dex removed the necklace, so it immediately reacted to the player's touch, the celestial medallion rose by itself. It seemed as if the power from the medallion was about to get out of control, the bright light mixed with menacing gusts of wind. Dex continued to stand still as he felt unknown pulses run through his body, and it felt as if this light was filling him up. The game immediately responded and notified the player that he had applied the item's special property, and it had now been assigned the class of Holy Prophet. But at this time, something began to happen. The player's profession was not in the category of saints. Controversy began, Celestial Medallion deactivated. The player looked at the body and saw two hidden class items. Error reappeared in front of the guy again. When the special effects stopped, Satan breathed out a sigh of relief. The demon thought that this divine light would incinerate his body. Dex himself was puzzled by what had happened. The boy twirled the celestial medallion in his hand, but it no longer reacted to outside factors. The shining celestial medallion has been temporarily deactivated due to a system error. Dex realized he was in even more trouble now. There was something going on near the barony on Mount Fianai, at the second entrance to the mines. Hyuntak returned to the game and decided it was worth trying to make money mining ore. Meanwhile, the guardsman held up a form in front of the kid and pointed to it. The player's eyes widened when he heard about the mine pass. The guardsman raised a finger in the air and told the player in a stern tone about the skipping rules. Hyuntak chuckled nervously. He had to find out what price to pay for the entrance. The man leaned closer to the boy, noticing the player's interest. His voice grew kinder. But when the price for the pass was quoted, the player's jaw dropped in horror. The guy's mind immediately began calculating the money he would need to make to at least repay the pass. Seeing the tears in the player's eyes, the guard immediately realized what was going on. The man bowed his head and touched on a sore subject for the player. After calming down, the boy embarrassedly told about his intention to make money in the mine. The guardsman clapped the player on the shoulder, and with a smile on his face, told him that the baroness does everything, even for those players who don't have money. Realizing that the customer was finally warmed up for the guardsman, pointed towards a small house. There was a customer service department there. There was a very nice girl sitting in the window. She smiled the whole time and looked professional in her work. The player, with a gleam in his eyes, noticed that girl and could no longer take his gaze away from her. The guardsman was pleased with himself. He'd done what was required and managed to recruit another fool. The player went towards the lodge to conclude his contract, not even realizing that he would become another slave of the mine. The mines of Mount Fian had until recently been categorically short of manpower. However, the long corridors of the mines now had a completely different appearance. The staff member was incredibly pleased that the players had unquenchable zeal in this not easy job. But she also realized it was all a scam for those who wanted easy money. The girl suspected that the baroness couldn't have come up with such a cunning plan on her own. She didn't know who helped the baroness. Suddenly, a sign popped up in front of Dex that he had completed the Baroness Michael's alert mission. The game was inviting the guy back. Dex told Tansik that they were finishing exploring the place and were coming back. When the host spoke in riddles, Tansik was even more puzzled because he couldn't understand Dex. Then the guy briefly relayed all the notifications he got when he opened the sarcophagus. For the game, Dex became the real villain. The player realized that he had too many secrets, and if anyone found out, he'd be in even more trouble. Tansik listened to his master in full tension. He had no idea of the man's intentions. Suddenly, Dex pulled out an ore mining drill from his inventory that immediately responded to the call and began to growl loudly in the player's hands. The demon was confused because the player was about to destroy the stairway to heaven with his own hands. But Dex didn't share the demon's anxiety. The guy acted like he was doing something very mundane. Using a magical drill, Dex managed to destroy the sacred site rather quickly. Dex was quick enough to accomplish this task. Having destroyed the room where the mystery lurked, the boy wiped his wet forehead and prepared to destroy the gate. It was all too much for Satan. With a sagging jaw, he found himself thinking that he should learn from this man. As soon as the Baroness saw Dex walk in, she jumped up from her chair in joy. Dex was pleased with his work and wondered if the Baroness had enough miners now. The Baroness clenched her fist and waved her hand. She went on to tell about the poor people who volunteered to be slaves to them when they heard the prohibitive cost of a mine pass. The Baroness looked at the guy like a real deity. Besides the fact that the mines produced ore, she also made a lot of money. Seeing how the Baroness had changed and how cheerful she had become made him feel better. He hoped that things would get better for the lady. The Baroness felt the power in her hands and even thought about squeezing everything out of her new slaves, and after a while she could become a countess. Dex decided to distract Mistress from her deep thoughts and reminded her that she should reward him for the task he had completed. The Baroness turned her head sharply and felt a little uneasy that she had forgotten such an important detail. Dex held a bag full of gold. It was the 10% they'd agreed on. Suddenly, the Baroness leaned over to the player and with excitement in her voice asked again if Dex wanted to continue working for her. A window with this offer immediately appeared in front of the player and Dex could agree to this. This offer sounded very tempting to him indeed. In the boundless expanse of Arcadia's virtual world, a hidden history has been born. It all started with one person, and for another, a guy and a girl had very tender feelings for each other. Lowering his head, the guy thanked the girl named Jennifer, for it was she who helped him find happiness in a world where he couldn't move without permission. He asked the girl to just watch because he managed to create a whole world for her. The guy's name was Jack, and he was the creator of Arcadia. Now, Jack stood in front of a large monitor and crossed his arms over his chest. In front of him was Alice, the administrator of this game. Jack hadn't seen Alice in a while because she'd been so busy lately. He decided to see if anything bad had happened. Alice bowed her head and reported a data contradiction error. Also, administration intervention was required to resolve this problem. In front of the guy appeared the information that caused such a mistake. He studied the materials with a smile on his face, and it aroused even more interest in him. Despite being the creator of an entire gaming universe, Jack never expected a destroyer to appear in his world. In addition to the appearance of the Anarchy Bard Destroyer, this player has also obtained a shining heavenly medallion, a special item of the Holy Prophet. To the class of saints was to belong only one person, the protagonist of the plot of the great battle of angels and demons. Jack couldn't help but be interested in such a problem. Turning to Alice, the boy was glad that he had once decided to create Arcadia. Alice brought Jack back to the pressing problem. She couldn't give a player with the nickname Dex the Holy Prophet class. Jack returned his gaze to the monitor and was in no hurry to solve this problem, wanting to think about it longer. But now, he didn't mind rewarding the player for finding such a valuable item. Alice listened attentively to her host and was surprised that he decided to change the properties of an important game item. Then Jack turned to Alice and reminded her that because of the player, the order of his world had been disturbed. And to make things even more interesting, Jack decided to use Archangel Michael to do it. Dex pondered the Baroness's offer for a while. Although it was tempting, he turned it down. The Baroness had been counting on Dex to reconsider the offer and accept, so his repeated refusal was very surprising. Dex politely reminded the girl that he wanted to travel and explore the continent, but at the same time, promised to consider her offer. Upon hearing this response, the Baroness jumped on the spot and got too close to the player's face. Dex was embarrassed by the proximity. She pretended not to notice. She had something else to give Dex. A white envelope with the Baroness's seal on it was on the stack. Baroness Michael gave Dex a letter of recommendation on her behalf. The girl assured the player that with this letter, he would be able to find protection in any corner of the kingdom. Of course, Dex was pleased with the Baroness's Zobata. He picked up the letter and began to study it. The girl sat down in her chair and spoke in a very serious voice. Raising a finger up, she was surprised that the player was unaware of the disturbance. Dex decided to find out more about the riots from Baroness Michael himself, but this was the first time he had heard of it. Other players had told him nothing of the sort. The Baroness bowed her head, and her voice became very sad. The speech was about a king who was already too old. But the trouble was that the prince who held the heavy burden of the crown was too young. The courtiers surrounding the prince were plotting intrigues and malicious attempts to gain power and strengthen their own position. And the worst of all these courtiers was Duke Birchin. He became the unspoken leader of the nobility, gathering around him the entire upper nobility. The Baroness also said that the Duke tried in every possible way to unleash a battle with a neighboring state. She folded her arms because the thought of what would happen to her country if Duke Birchin got into power was too much to bear. She was afraid of it all. Dex listened to the story condescendingly and decided to stay out of the story as much as possible. The guy had no idea how messed up the game's plot was. The Baroness raised her head and spoke again about the letter of recommendation. She wrote in it all the merits of the player and ordered to find the Earl of Brocken. Dex's face immediately twisted in horror when the Baroness spoke of the defense of the kingdom and the player's need to help fix the situation. At that very moment, a notice appeared in front of Dex's face about the mission he needed to accomplish. He read its contents. Dex smiled, but in his heart, he truly hated this insidious game. The Baroness leapt up from her seat again with a gleam in her eyes. She did not doubt in the least the nobility of this player. The Baroness went outside to wish the player a good journey and bid him farewell. The girl waved at him for a long time. Dex also waved goodbye, supposedly pleased, but in reality he was already doubting that being friends with the Baroness was even a good idea for him. When the player was distant enough, the girl put her hand to her chest. She had no doubt in her feeling and was sure that it was this player who could change the world. She saw something in Dex that the guy hadn't seen in himself yet. It felt like he was the missing link in the world, and the Baroness was not mistaken in her feeling. And so it was that a player named Dex began to rapidly change the world of Arcadia. Of course, this caused a lot of problems for the game administration. They only had time to find new bugs and try to keep the situation under control. Dex's actions have changed more than one fate in this universe. Players who came to the game for recreation and fun are now working without respite, mining ore for the barony of Michael. Dex had a long road ahead of him to the new mess he'd make in this game, and it would be one that would eclipse all his previous misdeeds. The player with the nickname Dex has left the barony of Michael. The other players had no idea that right now in this place, a real evil was passing them by. Before moving on, Dex stopped for a moment to enjoy the beautiful scenery. Tanchik decided to see if his master was okay. The demon looked at him in surprise, not expecting such an answer. Dex raised his head and made a fist to reassure himself that he could get integrity points for doing so he saw no point in staying out of it. The shining celestial medallion suddenly came to life and shimmered with a bright glow. The game immediately displayed a notification about the error correction and changed medallion parameters. Dex looked on in surprise, covering his face with his hands. The bright light cut through the guy's eyes like that. Tanchik looked at the medallion in horror and couldn't understand why it had suddenly come to life. The medallion completely changed its former shape and became more like two sky wings that were stacked on top of each other. The guy's eyes lit up with a golden light. He kept looking at the locket and was shocked at what was happening. The demon gawked his eyes and couldn't believe what he saw in front of him. One thing he knew for sure was that he didn't like this transformation. A huge silhouette of a guardian angel appeared in front of Dex. A girl with golden hair and snow-white wings towered over the player. After a series of bright flashes, a glorious miniature of Archangel Michael appeared in front of Dex. The girl with heavenly eye color folded her arms confidently. Angels and demons have long been each other's sworn enemies and simply could not exist peacefully under the same sky. Michael folded her arms across her chest and looked arrogantly at the demon. She didn't even doubt that he was scheming on sacred ground. Satan parried the angel's attacks and was sure that if she were in his place, she would do something similar. Their bickering had reached the brink of carnage. Angel and demon were ready to clash in a ruthless battle to prove their superiority to the other. Dex watched the little entities with a tired look. Their scolding only gave the player a headache. The guy had to stand between the two enemies to call them to calm most of all the psychotic demon who tried to destroy the winged saint. The demon was on one side of Dex, shouting loudly in his ear. He couldn't calm his heated blood. On the other side was Angel, who had the same explosive temperament as the demon and bickered with him about everything. Dex tried to abstract himself. From the screams, he realized one thing. Once upon a time, there was a battle, and Archangel Michael brought a sacred weapon with which he could wound a demon. For a moment, Dex realized that the creatures in front of him were legendary creatures he'd only heard about from legends. The angel flew closer to Dex and called out to him. She had shining stars woven into her hair. The creature looked like a celestial creature. Dex chuckled and admitted that there had indeed been such a moment in his life, but then he assured the angel that the contract was not of his choosing. Mikhail clasped her hands to her chest and spoke in a quiet voice. She wanted to warn. If his power fell into evil hands, he could do a lot of mischief. It was already clear what evil the angel was talking about, so Tanchik didn't miss the opportunity to insert his scolding demon was furious. Dex listened attentively to the angel who was trying to convey to him the importance of what was happening. She urged him to avoid bad intentions and not to be tempted by the evil one. Then Michael's gaze brightened, and she confidently declared that she would guard him like a guardian angel and help him not to stray from the true path. Dex stared at the saint in surprise as a bright light energy flickered around him, warming the player's body with heat. After listening to the angel's speech to the end, Tanchik couldn't refrain from teasing her. The demon arched an eyebrow defiantly and wasn't about to sit idly by. There was eye contact between the two. The girl was flaming because the demon lord was next to her. Tanchik couldn't resist, declaring that Dex was not an innocent man. Guy got a kick out of the demon lord crowning Dex. Dex understood that the Bard of Anarchy class was meant to bring destruction and chaos to the world of Arcadia. So Dex realized that Archangel Michael's mission was all about good deeds. Angel abruptly approached Dex and with a bright smile on her face, promised the player that she would guide him and guide him to goodness. At this magical moment, the demon intervened. He jabbed his finger irritably in Ellie's direction and promised to ignore her. Angel swiveled her head toward the demon and grinned snidely. She didn't think the demon was even worthy of receiving this power at all. And between the angel and the demon, the enmity flared up again. They started yelling at each other, and all their arguments revolved around the decency that Dex possessed. Dex once again stood back and quietly watched the two. He realized that he had another overly chatty companion. In a moment, Dex decided to address the angel and called out already by her new name. The girl responded. In fact, Dex didn't care if the girl was an angel or a demon. Money and economics ruled the world in the game. Dex told me that he didn't give Tank his integrity for nothing. He smiled and wanted to find out what Ellie could give him for his integrity points. Nothing in this world was free. And now, Ellie realized it. She stared at her host in surprise for a while. She thought about it and began listing the items she had in her arsenal. When Dex heard that, he waved his head in the air. But the player's wording was too squat for a creature like Archangel Ellie, didn't understand what he wanted from her at all. Realizing this, Dex put a finger up and told the angel what he meant. He didn't have good fighting skills. A more elaborate answer gave the girl cause to ponder. She bowed her head and began to ponder. With the Bard of Anarchy class, the player could get decency points and it was cool, but this class definitely had its drawbacks. Dex had been thinking about this for a while now. He had no combat skills, just non-combat skills like mining or diving. Suddenly, Ellie's head popped up and brightened up. The girl remembered and thought of something she could do to help her master. Archangel Michael stretched her hand out to the side, in her palm, sparkled with divine light, and as soon as that happened, the contract was concluded. Now, a player could use their decency to use divine power for a while. In front of the player appeared an icon that denoted the skill Divine Intervention. The player decided to immediately try out this skill to see how much it would be useful to him. A swirl of golden light swirled around the player. Tanchik watched his master with horror. This bright light caused the demon an unpleasant sensation. The synchronization with the Divine Intervention skill was so global that a bright pillar of light burst out somewhere in the sky. The Knight of Honor. Farhan showed up. He was dressed in snow-white armor with gold inlays and a long sword. Behind him arose Merlin, the great magician of truth. The man had long hair and a beard and was armed with a staff. Also appeared legendary archer from above, Purcell. She had light clothing and a golden bow. And the last was the great righteous thief, Mirfan. All his body was hidden by dark clothes. Armed with 2 blades, the face of this hero no one saw. Ellie proudly said that the player will be able to borrow the power of the great heroes of true faith for a while. Dex grinned. He really liked that kind of skill, and at a glance it looked pretty good. From the darkness of the forest came a terrifying and threatening voice that came out of the shadows and demanded everything the player had. 3 orcs appeared. They demanded treasure and promised the player an easy death if he did not resist. Dex grinned, pleased at the sudden appearance of the monsters. It was the best time to try out his new power. Fian Mountain, in one of the mines inside the mountain, work was in full swing. The players were exhausted, but because of the contract that bound them, they kept working. These people came to the world of Arcadia to play and have fun, but something went wrong in their lives, and they became slaves. Hentak let go of the pickaxe and cried. His hands were hurting a lot. The guy had long ago realized that he had screwed up and turned into a real slave. Leaning on his pickaxe, he bowed his head and clenched his teeth to get out of the mine. His friends were hunting, and he couldn't even tell them. At some point in his own whippings and admonishments about what an idiot he was, the guy abruptly realized that he wanted to get out of the damn place. At that very moment, 2 thugs were holding one player under their arms. The kid was tearing his throat out, screaming that he didn't buy the capsule to be a slave. A couple of players gathered behind Hyung-tak. They immediately realized that that player was trying to escape and assured the player that it was a big foolishness. One of the players told what consequences await whoever escapes. This player will turn into a deserter and become an outlaw in the entire kingdom. The other player, wiping his sweaty face, was apparently resigned to his fate. He was only thinking about paying back his debt to Baroness and getting out of this place as soon as possible. Hyun-tak assured the players that he had no thoughts of running away. In his heart, he was scared for his future. So with tears in his eyes, the player picked up the pickaxe again and swung it while continuing to work tirelessly. Suddenly, a notification box appeared in front of the player, saying that the longest burning flame was showing interest in him. The player with wide open eyes read the text in the notification. He didn't know what it was, for the longest burning flame. Knight of Honor Farhat, a legendary holy warrior who always brings victory to those who stand behind him. His weapon was a sword to strike fear and terror into evil demons. Also, this warrior had a golden shield. Many lives have been saved by standing behind his protection. When this knight came down to earth, it was already known that he would lead to victory. However, the demons who were his enemies called the knight by another name. One day, the demon howled in pain as the sword blade shattered the shield. Knight Farhan knew no pity for these monsters. He intercepted his sword that shone with a blinding light. The warrior marched forward to end the demon's fate. The Devil Destroyer. Farhan swung his sword and cut the monster's head in 2. The monster could not resist him and simply disappeared from the world with a screaming sound. The knight, with his faith and strength, continued to cleanse the world of terrible demons and monsters. This was his true path. The celestial being condescended. Now he could temporarily use the power of the Knight of Honor, Farhan. A golden blade appeared in Dex's hands. Tanchik watched in horror at the transformation of his master. He saw a very familiar sword and shield, and the anxiety in the demon's soul increased. The vestment appeared on Dex's body in one hand. A sword in the other was a shining shield. The player, with surprise and admiration, looked at it all, for he could not have thought what power he had acquired. Tank immediately flew up to Dex and protested about his attire. Dex looked up to the demon and was surprised that he knew who he was reincarnated as. In the world of demons, the Knight of Honor Farhan was a true evil one who could destroy monsters for no reason. For Tanchika, this warrior was the embodiment of fear and terror. Dex understood the demon's attitude, even though to all mankind, Farhan was a warrior who brought peace. Finished with accepting himself in his new form, Dex returned his attention to the waiting orcs. The orcs noticed the change in the player and tensed up. Now they realized that the victim they had found was not as simple as they had originally thought. Dex noticed the changed faces of the orcs and guessed that they noticed the changed aura around him. Player Dex moved to the special route after leaving Barony Michael. It was a shortcut to the player's next goal, but because of the monsters that inhabit these areas, other players did not venture into these parts. And the reason for this was the field boss orc warrior. He He had a huge size and intimidating appearance. Coping with such a monster alone was extremely difficult. There was no turning back for anyone. The orc swung his axe and headed towards the player. He wanted to destroy the guy and take all his treasures. The very moment the axe came down towards the player, Dex raised his arm with his shield in front of him. The defense was incredibly resilient. The guy was very pleased that he was able to try out the shield, and was pleasantly surprised that it actually prevented the weapon from advancing any further. The defense had dispelled, and now the player prepared for his attack. The orc clucked his tongue loudly, realizing that his attack had failed. Raising his sword arm up, Dex activated the flames of the blazing dawn. The sword was bathed in golden fire, and the silhouette of the Knight of Honor, Farhan, appeared at its tip. The orcs immediately realized their mistake. They began to stagger back in fear, and muttered to themselves under their noses that the player should spare them. But for Dex, it's just a game, and pleas for mercy don't matter. Besides, the guy wanted to test the power Ellie had given him. Dex's eyes lit up. One blow was enough to send the three bodies flying somewhere far away. Even the Christmas trees were ripped out of the ground with roots from such an excessive force. The orcs fell from a single blow Dex needed to realize how long he could use these abilities for. Ellie, meanwhile, watched the player with bated breath. She had no idea that Dex would be so brilliant with such power. At some point, the Archangel realized something. And now she understands why the creator sent her to this player. Watching Dex standing in the moonlight, she realized that he was the man who would change the course of the world. Ellie giggled softly as she witnessed such a momentous occasion. Meanwhile, Dex wasn't too happy about taking down the orcs in one hit. He wanted to break up the fight to test more of his skills. Sometime later, the two beings, angel and demon, finally fell silent and fell into a deep sleep. During this time, Dex couldn't sleep a wink. Leaning back against a tree trunk, the guy continued to study the information. Dex read through the details of the divine intervention skill and was pleased that he was able to use it right away. One of the big advantages was that this skill closed the difference in levels between the player and the monster that would stand against him. Originally, the items Dex bought from Tenchika covered that need. Dex didn't have the ability to physically buy up all the weapons, and those still had their limitations, so with some enemies, he had to rely on luck alone. The player had not acquired any combat items for this very reason. He kept thinking about all of this, and it seemed that this problem was now solved. But also, the skill had disadvantages. The first was naturally the cost. The player imagined how much it would cost to use this skill if he had a really strong opponent in front of him. She was amused by Dex's statement that divine intervention could cause him to cheer. Angels were early birds, but demons like to get a good night's sleep and rest, so Tunchik was still asleep. Angel heard about the player's worries about wasted integrity points. She assured him that Farhan was very powerful. Ellie spoke calmly and convincingly. She kept her heavenly eyes on the player. The angel went on to describe Dex's power, which was simply amazing and could make the impossible possible. Dex exhaled heavily. Even though he had a feeling he was being fooled, he still agreed with the angel. Then the guy told the angel that he would just be more careful with this skill and use it only when necessary. Kingdom of Maron. The Kingdom of Maron was the home base of the Korean server of Arcadia. Maron is considered a powerful and wealthy nation, despite its problems. And for the moment, the kingdom's internal affairs were not going as smoothly as one would have liked because of the prince's youth and inexperience. The kingdom was located in the heart of the second continent of Arcadia. Because of its excellent location, the kingdom was able to earn good revenues from trade intermediation. The kingdom also had several very large trade associations. Around the Great GM Merchants Association was bustling with activity. A furious merchant shouted in the street. He didn't like the fact that he wasn't met by the guild leader, but he had brought too much goodies. A man appeared out of nowhere and apologized in a polite tone for being so disrespectful to him. John Smith introduced himself as the GM store manager. Bowing his head in a bow, the man was going to give his full attention. John's eyes rose, and the man himself looked glum. He had to tell them that their head was now in a very important meeting. Duke Bershin grinned as he turned to the leader of the Great Merchant Association. Once again, the man spoke of the escalating situation between the kingdoms of Maron and Parkel. Choi was the leader of the Great GM Merchants Association. He folded his arms and grinned. At some point, the player was slightly skewed. He had never met such an NPS as the Duke. In front of the guy sat a real villain. Duke Bershin was too dangerous a man in this game, manipulative and scheming. He could have run an entire army if he wanted to. Knowing all this, the player still went to meet with the Duke. He had read that this man would be a great ally for his guild. Choi had no idea that he would meet this NPS so soon, and was glad that he was able to find information about the Duke in time. Choi Jae-gyu was the youngest son of the chairman of GM Group in the real world. The kid was always getting into trouble at work, and his father lost faith. As soon as something didn't go according to plan, the kid just ran away. Choi felt pressured by his father, and didn't understand how it was happening. This time, his father gave him one last chance. GM Group was Korea's largest corporation, and Choi Jae-kyu's father worked there, and this company specialized in earning currency by playing Arcadia. It was Choi who led the GM Merchant Association guild players in Arcadia were making real money. And now representatives of the real and virtual worlds met at the negotiating table. Each had their own motivations. Duke Bershin narrowed his eyes. He had heard about the rapidly growing guild, and so had sought it out. He liked that the adventurers had a strong bond. Choi smiled when the Duke offered to buy up all the grain he could find and promised a reward. The Duke continued to speak, promising that he would open up profitable avenues of the kingdom, but he also wanted the task to be accomplished without too many questions and noise. When the NPS finished speaking, Choi blurted out a cheerful assent to such an offer. It was a great chance for him to get rich well. The conversation was over because Duke Birchin saw no point in lingering any longer. The man got up from the table and left the room. Choi was alone with his thoughts. Such a deal had come into his hands, the guy couldn't believe his own luck. John Smith entered the room and heard that a deal had been agreed upon. He was glad for his young master. Choi jumped up from his seat. Excited by the interesting case, he was already rushing to tell his father about it. John Smith stopped the guy, and because of that, Choi's enthusiasm waned a little. The guy didn't understand why he couldn't ask for more investment. The offended head crossed his arms and loudly tisked. He himself realized that it would be too problematic to get more money out of him. Choi could think of nothing but help. He'll provide supplies for the kingdom, and then there's a good chance Duke Birchin can take the throne. The guy was already dreaming that this was going to happen, and then with such a powerful ally, Choi and his GM Merchant Association would become the leaders on the Korean server. Count Brocken was the third most important person in the Maron Kingdom. He had a deep scar over one of his eyes, and it gave him a more sinister appearance. Dex gave a satisfied nod to the Count as a sign that his assumption was correct. The boy was pleased that he was able to get to Brocken soon enough. The Count took the Baroness's letter of recommendation from the player's hands and twirled the envelope with curiosity. Dex was sure he could get protection from the Count with that letter. He didn't know what it said, but it was obviously something interesting about him. There was the sound of tearing paper in the hall. The Count tore the letter from the Baroness into 2 pieces without regret. Dex was surprised that Brocken would do such a thing, since he hadn't even read the contents of the letter. The man grinned. He wasn't going to read the letters, but wanted to hear from the player himself as to why she had decided to send Dex to the Count. Dex understood the Count's game, but decided that for the moment he'd rather pretend to be a stupid player who had no idea why he was sent to him. They met eyes, and the tension in the hall increased. Between them, there was a struggle of characters invisible to others. Suddenly, Count Brocken burst into a loud laughter. Such an attitude of the young lad was to his liking. The Count bowed his head and covered his eyes. The reason the Baroness sent the player to him was obvious. Dex decided to continue playing the innocent guy role. He smiled and admitted that such words were too flattering for him. At the same time, the Count watched Dex. He noticed that the player was not surprised that a battle was brewing in the country. Brocken's lips stretched into a smirk. This time, Dex told the Count what he knew. The boy realized that the prince's entourage was putting a lot of pressure on him and that Duke Birchin himself was leading the movement. The man covered his eyes and nodded. The boy was saying all the right things. He knew more than the Count realized. Now that the player's words had been confirmed, Dex thought about it. He had various thoughts in his head and wanted to present them to the Count. The Count's head popped up when he heard about the 2 solutions. One was complicated, but the other was simple. Dex raised his finger and said that the Arcadia universe considered Duke a criminal player and suggested that if you got rid of the character, the whole organization would collapse as well. Count Brocken's face immediately changed when he realized that he had just been offered the chance to destroy Duke Birchin himself. Dex didn't see anything wrong with it, so he gave it a thumbs up. The Count's sudden loud laughter resounded throughout the hall once again. He could not settle down. The player in front of him was indeed a very interesting player. Dex was uncomfortable every time the man suddenly burst into laughter. His voice was too sonorous, like the Count's body itself. This plan was really good, and even the Count himself had thought about it more than once. But there was one big problem with it, and that was security. He was surrounded by trained men. The lad's plan amused the Count. The man wouldn't mind meeting the man who would dare to undertake this risky assignment. Dex continued to smile and jabbed his finger at himself and was not averse to committing to this plan. The guy's eyes were brimming with enthusiasm. The Count looked at the player with great doubt, and this time, he was no longer so amused. Looking at Dex, the man did not see him as a warrior. The man didn't want to mock the player. He liked the boy's intelligence, but he couldn't see him as a hero who could take on the Duke himself. Looking at Dex, Count Brocken saw a very weak first-level player. The man didn't understand what this player was hoping for. Now, Dex was ready to have some fun. Up until this point, the guy had been pretending to be a silly boy, but now his true colors were revealed. A strange aura that had been lurking all this time appeared in the hall, and the Count physically felt it on him. This confidence made the man more interested in the man he didn't want to be kept in the dark any longer, so he stood up from his seat and invited Dex to follow him. They went to the back patio where there was a training ground. The Count wished to test this confident boy by his own efforts. The man threw his huge hands over his shoulders and began kneading his muscles. He knew Baroness Michael's temperament and was confident in her insight about other people. Dex was wary. Now a strong and formidable adversary had appeared before him who wished to test the boy's strength. Count Brocken drew his sword, and an incredible scarlet energy erupted around him. A notification appeared below that this NPS was a swordmaster. Dex had nothing left to do but prove his ability to fight. The guy only lip-synced his strength. Behind the player's back appeared the silhouette of the wandering knight, Kophelis. The warrior had 2 swords and maneuvered them very skillfully. At the same time, a pillar of green light burst out from the player's body. The Count immediately tensed his entire body, not expecting such a drastic change in this player. The Count could not understand how he had been tricked. He looked at the lad with all his eyes and saw a different player. And now, as he looked at Dex, he realized that the man in front of him was a man who had spent his life training with a sword. Looking up at the man who continued to stare, puzzled at the apparent change in the player, Dex assumed that 5 minutes would be enough for him. The boy's statement immediately reached the man's ears. He was even more surprised at such confidence. Since a lot of integrity points were being spent, Dex needed to get to the bottom of this as soon as possible. So without wasting any more time, he moved to the side. Count Brocken felt the force of Dex's blow with his own hands and was very surprised that such a fragile boy could hit so hard. Dex had counted on the fact that it would only take 1 blow, but he hadn't considered the fact that the swordmaster himself was standing in front of him. The Count looked at the player standing in front of him with a different eye. He realized how wrong he had been about this guy from the beginning. Dex grinned. He was amused to see the man's opinion of him change dramatically. The man threw his hand up and summoned all his strength, this time, to also show the player what he was capable of. Dex looked at the NPS with a strained expression, hoping to the last minute that their fight wouldn't go that far. The Count's scream tore at his throat. He swung his sword. Now he realized before him stood a worthy opponent. The man saw no point in holding back. Dex saw the fire streak coming. He had to make a decision quickly or the Count's strike could be his last. The Count squinted at the player, and at one point the man's eyes widened in surprise. The force that burst into Dex's space failed to reach its target. The player crossed the blades over his head, and they were able to become his shield. Brocken saw the technique Dex used and immediately realized he was a very skilled fighter. At the same time, Dex lowered his gaze to the notification boxes. The system informed the player that he had used the skill for level 150th players. The Count watched Dex intently as he remained in his fighting stance. Unwittingly, the man noticed that the boy was talking to himself fleetingly. Dex could no longer stay with the skill activated. There were already too many decency points spent. The player snapped out of his seat and pounced on his opponent. 1,000 blows in incredible force were pressing down on the man's body. He grabbed the sword with both hands and tried to withstand such a crazy onslaught of the player. Brocken's veins swelled on his face as the man snarled and panted, as if he was about to be able to repel this terrible attack. But Dex himself didn't feel the same weight. The guy was looking for the swordsman's weaknesses and waiting for the right moment. The player's sword passed through the Count's defenses. The man's hand slid down. He only had time to notice a bright flash of power streak across his body. The Count's huge body collapsed to the floor. There were many cracks around them from Dex's sword strikes. The Count was breathing heavily and could not believe that after such a serious attack he was still alive. Now there was no doubt that in front of him was a strong warrior. Dex looked fearfully at the notice that told him how many decency points he had spent on this fight. Ellie Angel immediately noticed that Dex was facing an opponent of a different level than the monsters in the forest. Ellie looked at her master because his sword skills were amazing. Dex admitted he used to play the sport. The Count could not move from his seat, being completely discouraged by such a fight. He clung to his wounded shoulder and was immersed in his thoughts. Dex turned his head as he felt the Count's gaze on him. The man still couldn't get to his feet, but the curiosity in his heart had taken over, and the Count wanted to know what element Dex's sword was. This was an unexpected question for the player, so he thought about it for a while and intuitively assumed that it could be the wind. The man's eyes bulged with excitement. He knew that the wind power was more nimble than anyone else in the world. He sincerely wanted to get close to such a skill of this player. It's been a while, and Brocken has been training relentlessly. Now the man has met a rival of superior strength. After a while, they returned to the Count's house. The man bowed sincerely and apologized to the player for his recent cold reception. Dex felt awkward about it and was not angry at the Count for his recent behavior. Still in a low bow, the man raised his eyes and looked at Dex. He wanted to hear a response regarding his intentions to destroy Duke Berhani. Dex thought it was the easiest way to solve their problem, but he was worried about the chaos that would ensue after the Duke's death. The man immediately straightened up, and his eyes looked excitedly at the player. He had never heard of this before. Then Dex briefed us on the specifics of this knot. It was tied in a way that made it impossible to untangle. The player raised his index finger up and looked at the man. After all, there was still one way to handle this knot. He endured the intrigue. The man leant forward, being very interested in the matter, for the NPS had no idea what trickery was lurking here. Dex shrugged and told him with a smile on his face that the knot could have been destroyed. You could spend days and nights untangling this knot, but you could make one incision and the problem would just go away. Of course, there were consequences to that method. Dex smiled because it wouldn't be his story. He hoped it would work itself out somehow. Realizing that Gordiev's knot was cited as an example, the man was even more surprised. Before him stood not an ordinary man, but a cunning and very dangerous player. In any case, it was this player who offered a solution to their lingering problem. The Count bowed his head again and gave his approval. The conversation was over, and Dex saw no point in lingering in this place any longer. He had successfully taken the first step to play a decisive role in the fate of the Kingdom of Maron. A side quest popped up in front of the player's face. He looked at it condescendingly and realized that the game itself was not averse to getting rid of Duke Berhene. Out of Dex's hood came Tanchik. He started giggling in hopes that his master was going to destroy Duke Berhen. Ellie appeared on the other side of the hood and immediately protested. She didn't want Dex to go to such a low and horrible act. The angel and the demon were once again in a heated argument. Ellie herself was not opposed to the task. She just didn't like the fact that Dex was going to do it covertly. Having listened to all the demands of the angel, Tanchik just wilted from her words. She, in any task, searched for ways of honor and nobility. Dex already had dark circles under his eyes. He exhaled tiredly and asked the two companions to stop bickering with each other. It was a statement that really had its power. Angel and the demon looked at their master with darting eyes. Dex was in no hurry to make a decision. In truth, Dex didn't care about the battle that could happen between the two kingdoms. There was only one thing he cared about in this situation. Dex's eyes twinkled as he decided for himself that he would help whichever side gave him the most money. The decision was unexpected. Ellie started to protest. Dex made a promise he couldn't break, but Tunchi was once again delighted. With his head up, Dex wasn't about to go back on his promises. The guy was willing to break his word without hesitation. On the news channel, the anchorwoman spoke enthusiastically about the success of Arcadia and mentioned the rise in share prices, which was a good indicator. Choi Soon-yeon held his head and snorted with irritation. A note of envy was present in his voice, as he still couldn't understand how someone managed to achieve such an accomplishment. He was angry that his company and Arcadia's were on the same level 5 years ago. Most of all, he was concerned about the dreamer, with the appearance of which the whole world market shook up and underwent huge changes. Sun-young's head ached with heavy thoughts. He realized that his company also needed to start learning something new. The chairman's office was very abruptly entered by his youngest son. He was out of his mind with happiness and could not hold back his emotions. Hearing the amount of money his son needed, the chairman's face immediately twisted, and now it seemed as if his son had brought no good news. Sun-young was confused, as he had just recently given his son the same large sum of money. It was as if he hadn't heard the menacing tone in his father's voice. The father was still unhappy about his son's request. Folding his hands in a tenacious lock, a vein began to pulsate in the man's face. A weighty stack of papers fell on the chairman's desk with a resounding smack. The man looked curiously at the stack, but was in no hurry to touch it. First, he wanted to hear answers from his son. Jae-gyu was so confident of his success that he didn't rush to explain to his father the intricacies of his plan. He decided that he would act like a true businessman this time around. A while later, the chairman was studying the papers. There was a plan to take over the kingdom of Maron. Having read enough, he looked up and still wanted to hear from his son. Jae-gyu was pleased with his father's reaction. He noticed how his face stretched. Not without a smirk, the boy put his hand to his chest and assured the chairman of truthfulness. The man saw a really perfect plan in front of him. He wanted his son's success to have an impact on their company so they could get ahead of the game. Jae-gyu's face twisted, and his heart was ready to jump out of his chest. The chairman was willing to give a sum that was 10 times the amount he had asked for himself. The chairman further insisted that this was the last time he would invest in his youngest son's idea. The boy was overjoyed. He didn't even count on his father's generosity. Jae-gyu had promised a dozen times that everything would work out. The man was left alone in his office, with his arms folded across his chest, as he continued to wonder if his son would be able to succeed. Duke Berchen's residence was truly monumental. At the entrance to the hall stood the guards who guarded the peace of the master. They held sharp pikes in their hands and were ready to use them on the intruder of order. Lord Leonidas was a secret envoy from the Harmel Empire and had come for an audience with the Duke Berchen looked at the young man with curiosity and wanted to know what could have brought him to him. The news of the coming battle had already reached even to such distant lands. Lord Leonidas came to the Duke to make an alliance. The Duke's gaze became sharper when Lord Leonidas spoke of helping the Duke ascend to the throne. It was exactly what he so badly desired. The Harula Valley was nestled among the Rocky Mountains, where the border between the Kingdom of Maron and the Harmel Empire was located. It was clear that they wished to acquire this land to strengthen their position and the defense of the country. Seeing no ulterior motive in this request, the Duke was easily willing to hand over the lands of the valley. In return, he would receive excellent support. Duke Berchen was very pleased that things were working out in his favor. The man did not hide his joy in front of his guest. Lord Leonidas was also pleased with the alliance. He had heard of the Duke's bad character and hoped he would not cheat his empire. The audience was over, and Lord Leonidas left the Duke's reception hall. He still had doubts about the alliance, but saw no other way out. When the Duke was left alone, his face contorted with a wicked grin. The man could not help but rejoice at the events that were swirling around him. There was only one man in this country more important than the Duke, but he was the 8-year-old prince, whom Berchen was ready to destroy and take the royal throne. Someone entered the Duke's hall and could not help but notice that the man was in good spirits. The Duke raised his head and glanced obliquely at the intruder. Choi bowed courteously to the Duke. He had come to have an audience with him. There was a big deal brewing between them, and the young man wanted to be in control. With a smug grin, Choi began to tell the Duke about the work he had already done. The Duke couldn't help but be pleased that he had found such an ally. He liked the young man's words and wanted to know more. Choi excitedly explained the method by which he achieved such a striking success. The guy called it a gift exchange. The Duke grinned and with a new look assessed the adventurer standing before him. He clearly underestimated the ambition of his ally. Now that the player had served before the Duke, he had a very strong desire to hear something important. The boy with bowed head and tense face looked at the man. The Duke knew something like this would happen. The man rose from his chair and made a statement that he was too busy for such matters at the moment. Such a statement greatly agitated the young man. Choi gave in, forward wanting to rebuke the Duke for his intransigence. The player did not expect to hear such a reply. The Duke interrupted the player, realizing what he was trying to push. The man's face did not look friendly. A sharp look of appraisal looked at the guy. Seeing the Duke with that look, Choi immediately clenched his teeth. This man frightened the guy, and no matter how much he was angry, the fear was stronger. Choi clenched his fists tightly. Now he couldn't risk their alliance, so he quickly began to deny his distrust of Duke Berhina. Such an answer satisfied him. Disappointment and fear swept through the young man's body. Choi could do or say nothing. He had to agree and back down. When the annoying adventurer left the office, Duke Birchin smirked with a sense of power. Choi was angry because as soon as he left the Duke's office, he immediately blew his steam on the nearest wall. What annoyed the young man most of all was that he was powerless to do anything. He'd invested too much money in this business. He couldn't quarrel with the Duke. Choi bought up all the grain that was available in the markets and invested literally all the money his father gave him into the business. But even this money was not enough to control all the grain distributed in Arcadia. Now the plan was to make a profit on the deal. The guy had already calculated how much he could make. It was a very big deal. Choi was so excited that his tightly clenched fists trembled. He most wanted the battle to begin, and then grain prices would skyrocket. While the boy was trying to calm his anxiety, he didn't immediately notice the man walk by. The hooded, cloaked stranger walked close by. Choi raised his head sharply and looked at the passing stranger. A strange feeling overcame the boy's soul. Dex walked by with a slight smirk on his lips. Choi stood still for a while and could only stare at the player's back. At some point, he wanted so badly to know who this man was that Choi broke away and ran after him. He called out to the stranger, but the guy had already managed to disappear around the corner. Choi looked nervously down the empty corridor. A dangerous feeling never left his mind. He clearly realized that something was wrong with that man. The player who felt the strange feeling could not help but notice the fact that the player who passed by him, although he was wearing a cloak, but underneath it was hiding equipment. Many questions swooped into Choi's head. His teeth and jaw clenched tightly. He had to understand why such a player would go to meet with the Duke. Fearing that the player's plans might be jeopardized, he gestured with his hand to call the mercenaries to him. Two cloaked men appeared before their master at the same second and bowed on one knee. The two mercenaries wore identical masks on their faces. They heard the order to observe an unknown player. The young man didn't know who the gambler might be, but he knew the price at stake. The audience between the Duke and Dex began. The man lifted the scroll in his hand and examined it closely. It was a letter of recommendation from the Earl of Brocken himself. The Duke examined the boy with an appraising look. He was curious what was so interesting about the player that he was recommended by Count Brocken himself. Suddenly Dex, with a bright smile on his face, declared Count Brocken's intentions to commit the destruction of Duke Berhina. Such a statement surprised the Duke very much, but the man tried, with all his might, to restrain himself. True, the letter of recommendation suffered a little bit. Dex decided that he could tell Brocken's plans. In great detail, the player told the Duke about the reason why he wanted to destroy him. A genuine anger was brewing in the Duke's heart. He was furious at such a statement from a player and wished to hear solid proof of it. Dex grinned. He didn't need proof, since the Duke knew it well enough himself. The boy only reminded the man of it. Duke Berchin laughed quietly, folding his hands in front of him, and lowering his head, he nodded several times. The demon was shocked at Dex's action getting out of the folds of Satan's hood. Satan began to resent. Ellie saw nothing wrong with it. Suddenly, Tansik froze, thinking it might be some kind of plan of Dex's. The guy wasn't stupid at all and was probably up to his own cunning game. Dex's gesture only confirmed Tanchika's guess. The guy discreetly put a finger to his lips, and a slight smirk curved his lips. The Duke was still shocked by such a statement, as he had always considered Earl Brocken a very righteous member of society. The Duke also realized that the adventurer standing in front of him could not just tell him about this plan. Folding his hands, the man looked at the player and got down to business. The sudden words of the player very much excited the Duke. For the conversation was about who should become the leader of this kingdom. Dex smiled even wider, saying that he sees only Duke Berchin on the throne because he meets all the requirements for such an important position. The Duke suddenly burst into loud and uncontrollable laughter. The boy's words had such a strong effect on him that he could not restrain himself. The player was getting more and more interested in the Duke. When the man calmed down, he wanted to know the name of this player with a smile on his face. Dex introduced himself and they shook hands. The Duke hoped they would work well together and was pleased with the new alliance. The player bowed his head slightly and stated courteously that he would try his best not to disappoint the Duke. That was the end of their conversation. Dex no longer saw the point of staying in the Duke's residence, so after their audience, the player left it. Ellie was praying for Dex's sinful soul. But Tansich was pissed that the guy came up with a really weird plan. Dex was tired of such annoying pressure from Tanchika. Turning his head with irritation, the player stated so, trying to consider possible developments. Such a statement surprised and interested the two companions. At the same time, they quieted down and looked at the player carefully. A battle between the two kingdoms was inevitable. It was only a matter of time, whether it was the Maron kingdom or Parkel who declared it. Dex raised a finger and looked at his companion slyly. He wants to wait until the battle is at its height, when it will be impossible to predict events. Tanchik didn't understand. He folded his arms and wanted to know why he wouldn't just go over to the Duke's side. Dex cocked his head with a wry smile. He had his own thoughts on the matter. Satan's face changed dramatically, and beads of sweat appeared on him. One small truth came to him. His master looked deeper into the problem. Dex's sinister smirk only confirmed that Tanchik's hunch was correct. The boy was already anticipating the chaos that would ensue in the kingdom. The demon lord himself could not have thought of such cunning. Tanchik was once again convinced that he was facing real evil. An ancient book appeared in front of the demon. He grabbed a quill and began to write something down quickly, mumbling under his breath. Ellie was curious to know what Satan was doing. Dex started humming a cheerful tune and stretched himself. The guy felt that a very significant change in the game was about to happen. Hearing the extraneous voice, Dex froze in place in surprise. In front of the player appeared two unknown people dressed in black cloaks. These figures seemed very tall and blocked Dex's way. The guy wasn't confused, but he didn't say anything, he just hummed. He was now wondering where this meeting would lead him. At the Great GM Merchants Association, unknown masked men gathered. They were in the lobby and could come to the Master's aid at any time. The two who had been following Dex led him to the guild leader himself. Dex was surprised to see him, and Choi invited the player to sit down for a chat. Since Dex was surprised to be invited by such an important man for an audience, Choi was immediately proud of himself. The guys looked at each other, and each had a suspicious thought. Both realized that this was not a simple meeting, and each was looking for their own purposes in it. Dex sat down at the table. Choi continued to study the player with his gaze and tried to figure out what Dex had in mind. Seeing no more point in being nice, Dex asked directly why he'd been brought here. He heard Choi say he was going to check something out. The pressure on Choi was intense. The guy was so worried about the deal that he couldn't help but try to find out what this player's conversation with Duke was about. Dex laughed. He was surprised at such a cheeky desire to know about his audience with the Duke. Choi couldn't take it anymore and thumped his fist on the table. The guy was stressed out, and the player sitting in front of him was also mocking him. The guild leader was out of his mind with anger on his face. Even veins swelled up. He somehow had to hear what Duke was talking about with the player. Tanchika and Ellie were panicking, worried about their host. They were very scared of the guy across the street. But Dex, on the other hand, thought that Choi wanted a lot. Dex quickly began to decide what he should do. In his head, he realized how many hired men were in the guild in case he had to fight. Choi continued to stare at the player with irritation and wait. It was clear that the guild leader's patience would soon be gone. Dex realized that they weren't going to let him out of here that easily. He was ready to use his power and resort to drastic measures. But suddenly, another man appeared in the audience. He was courteous and spoke in a calm tone. John Smith bowed and rephrased the question. Dex immediately turned his attention to the man and was glad he'd shown up on time. The guy seemed like the right person to continue a quiet conversation with. Choi became furious and jumped to his feet, yelling loudly and pointing his finger at Dex to threaten him. Such threats didn't scare Dex at all. He still sat in his chair with his arms folded across his chest. The player grinned and wanted to know the details. Such self-confidence further enraged Choi boyfriend. Grimaced with indignation, his veins were actively pulsing. John Smith approached his master very abruptly and vigorously began to correct his tie. Choi recoiled in surprise. The man leaned over to Choi and with just his lips commanded him to calm his temper. The young man had overstepped his bounds, in John Smith's opinion. Choi twitched. He didn't even want to hear something like that, but he clenched his teeth and shut up. John Smith bowed to Dex and apologized. He explained that it was because of his master's distress at having to sacrifice for the deal. Dex had fun watching what was going on. The player also noticed that this man had no small influence over the guild leader. At one point, the man raised his stern gaze and quietly spoke that they were not from a simple organization. Then he said the name of a very influential company that any Korean knew, GM Group. And of course, Dex had heard about it. His eyes widened for a moment as the player didn't expect to hear about it. Then a bag full of gold coins fell on the table very loudly. Some coins could not stay in place and bounced in the air. Dex lowered his gaze to the money pouch. This pouch could be his if the player stops interfering with the guild's ability to resolve their issues with the Duke, Choi. All this time, just kept silent. Leaning on his arm, the guy only looked at the unknown adventurer from under his forehead. The head of the Merchants Association hoped for the discretion of the player. After waiting a decent amount of time, Dex grabbed the pouch. He saw nothing wrong with it and was happy to accept the payment. Now all the player had to do was not complete the task from the Duke. John Smith and Choi stared in surprise at the player who was so easily willing to betray the Duke's trust for a modest bag of gold by their standards. After a while, Dex was released. Now the player was walking through the dark woods in the company of his two companions. Angel and Demon were actively discussing what had happened in the Merchant Association. Dex was perfectly happy with the way things had gone. He'd avoided trouble and had some extra money. It was a gift that pleased his soul. The player's mind was spinning with thoughts of the GM group. He imagined various scenarios and how the company could benefit. Standing under the light of the moon, Dex was convinced of only one thing. If the battle did begin, it would be to his advantage. The guy's soul was caught by Choi, who as it turned out had a very rich family. A wicked grin appeared on Dex's face. Tansik and Ellie noticed their host's mood and looked at him warily. They had been feuding for centuries, but now they agreed on one thing. Dex was up to something. Dex laughed loudly, his cheeks turning pink. The player had come to one conclusion because of all that had happened. He would have to destroy Duke Birchin after all. Tunchi immediately sank back in shock at his master's loud declaration. Ellie, on the other hand, was overjoyed. She thought Dex was going to get destroyed because of his word to Brocken. In total indignation, Tanchik wanted to find out what had occurred to his master, that he had changed his mind so radically, he didn't want to feel any more trouble. The stars twinkled in Ellie's eyes. She immediately rushed to admonish her master and offered to challenge Duke Birchin to a duel. She was glad they would keep their word to Count Brocken. Dex approached Ellie and firmly stated that he would not be able to challenge the Duke to a duel. Ellie listened attentively to her master, hoping that he had found an honorable solution. But when the angel heard that the guy was going to do everything quietly, her face petrified. Ellie trembled with worry, because this was not what she wanted at all. The only thing Dex didn't expect was for the angel to immediately turn away from the player. The girl had no intention of getting involved and wouldn't help her host. There was a verbal argument between Ellie and Dex, which Tanchik watched. He exhaled tiredly and didn't understand why they were making so much noise. Suddenly, the demon's face lit up with a clear smile. He realized something. An idea had come into his head very suddenly, and he wanted to share it with his master. Tansik immediately called out to Dex, who continued to negotiate with Ellie. Angel didn't even want to hear anything. The demon lord put his hand to his chest. Satan's gaze filled with bloodlust. He offered his help without hesitation. Dex froze in thought, and in a moment he realized that Tansik could have empowered the player as the angel had. The smirk that stretched across the demon's face only confirmed Dex's hunch. In fact, the demon also possessed spiritualism. A great realization came to Dex's mind. The boy's eyes widened, and he listened to the demon's words with bated breath. There was no point in waiting any longer. The demon immediately got down to business. Under the player's feet, a magical purple circle lit up. A strong wind snapped, lifting Dex's cloak. All around, lit up with a mysterious glow. The player looked at what was happening around him with awe. He was both scared and curious at the same time. He concentrated on watching the demon's actions. Dex had made a pact with the demon world and could now borrow the powers of the demon of his choice. Feeling his power, fear immediately vanished. A sign popped up in front of the player's face. He scrutinized its contents. The wind continued to blow gustily in his direction, creating an atmosphere of grandeur of the moment. In the box in front of him were pictures with the option to choose a character. These were creatures from the demonic world, and Dex could choose any of them. Tunchik immediately flew over to his master and wanted to know if Dex was happy. The boy nodded his head and smiled. He had no idea that Tunchik would surprise him like this. Dex wondered why Tanchik hadn't told him about it before. Ellie jumped in. Dex narrowed his eyes. He was hiding a very powerful force, and the demon was surprised that his master didn't mind using demonic powers. Either way, Dex dismissed other thoughts and went back to choosing a character. The player's finger pointed to a picture of one of the demonic characters. In Dex's opinion, this particular skeleton looked pretty good. Tanchik leaned over Dex's shoulder and inquired curiously as to why this particular character had been chosen. Ellie didn't want to be a part of it all, but interest still won out. She quietly peeked at the list in front of the player. Lich Argamer was one of the major necromancers of the afterlife, a witch doctor who plunged the mainland into utter horror. In the places where the legions of Lich Argamer had passed, nothing and no one was left alive, and even hundreds of years later, many still spoke of him as the personification of death. Dex climbed to the roof of one of the houses and watched intently what was going on below. Two guards led a nighttime look around Duke Birchin's residence. Dex assessed them and decided that those were not so strong. One of the guards felt a strange feeling. He looked up, trying to find something suspicious. The guard pointed to the roof of a neighboring house. There was someone strange, and it was hard to call him a person. Dex didn't see the point in waiting. He was eager to try out his new power, so he immediately summoned the Lich of Argamer. The air around the player vibrated. The guards immediately felt the pressure. A flash of unknown force shook everything around them. They realized it was an attack. The power around Dex dissipated, but there was still a terrible dark energy emanating from his body. A red skull mask appeared on his face. Argamer successfully entered his body. Tongues of dark energy began to wriggle around the guard. He raised his hand and grasped the hilt of his sword. The unknown player continued to stand on the roof and did not take any action yet. Dark magical energy continued to emanate from his body. The guard clenched his teeth, knowing they faced a serious enemy. He had no doubt that the danger was too great, so he ordered Rettel to do everything he could to catch the villain. The man further assured that if need be, they could even destroy the dark mage. Rettel disagreed. Talking was over. The moment the dark energy took the form of terrifying demonic creatures, Rettel immediately thrust his sword into the ground and summoned a holy shield to protect him. A bright sunshine immediately lit up around him and repelled the dark force. Dex nodded contentedly as he watched the guard's actions. The boy appreciated their ability and intelligence. At that very moment, while Rettel was fighting off the Dark Force's attack, the first guard rushed toward Dex. A golden glow fought back in the guard's eyes. He roared, gathering all the strength in his body to crush the enemy with a single blow. Except, the stranger wasn't frightened at the sight of all the combat power heading his way. A grin stretched across Dex's face. A demonic creature with a long spear in its hand appeared from behind Dex's back and pointed its weapon toward the Guardian. The dark spear fired by the demon pierced the guard's chest in an instant, and the paladin's eyes bulged from the pain and realization of what had happened. In an instant, the guard's body began to dry up. The man raised his head and shouted at the top of his voice that the enemy before them was a necromancer. The paladin's sword collapsed to the ground. Rettel stared at his partner's weapon in horror. Rettel heard his partner scream. The man began to tremble with fear, realizing that the powerful force could indeed belong to the necromancer. Just as he began to turn around with thoughts that they urgently needed reinforcements, a dark spear pierced Rettel in an instant. Dex wasn't going to have a real battle in this place, and he couldn't let the guards make a fuss, so he dealt with them quickly. 2 guards without signs of life lay on the cold tiles. Above them, demonic dark energy continued to ooze out. Dex smiled in his eyes, a glimmer of light from the dark power. Now he had a great chance to fully experience his new power and capabilities. The lifeless bodies of the guards were picked up by the dark energy and began to lift them. As Dex willed, a terrible fate began to befall them. In an instant, the 2 guards were filled with dark powers and turned undead. Their strength depended on how much power they had when they were alive. Dex was filled with joy at having this ability. He kept thinking about that smug GM group player. Necromancers had a very frightening and ruthless power. Dark magic flowing in their bodies could endlessly summon the undead. To do this, they only needed corpses and a good supply of energy. Thanks to this, necromancer was able to raise an entire army of terrible dead people. One necromancer had the power to replace an entire army. This is why necromancers were very valuable in major military actions or sieges. And on this night, a young player named Dex decided to test his new abilities by reviving destroyed guards with his power. Dex had a strategic mindset. That's why he made a quick decision and prepared to lay siege to the residence. There was real chaos going on downstairs. The knights were giving orders, and their first thought was that the residence had been attacked by the kingdom of Parkel. Unfortunately, the sacred knights who were expected to help were already dead. The skeletons were enslaved to the dark forces. The man turned his head in fear in the direction where the main cluster of evil magic was located. Dex didn't take people prisoner. Today, he would fully enjoy the power. The boy grinned wickedly and waved his index finger at the surviving knights. A very tall and large warrior rose in front of the knights. A dark aura spilled around him. The knights looked up in horror. Fear, pain, and terror filled the bodies of the knights. They had never seen something like this before and didn't know what to do now. Dex walked down to the knights. With a smirk on his face, the player welcomed them into the ranks of his army. He gave them their first order. The newly converted fiends kneeled before their master. Being now living skeletons, the warriors were tasked with finding Duke Berhana. The knights immediately went to do their new master's bidding. Having dark powers, they could move with quick jumps. Dex stayed put. Raising his head higher, the boy watched as the knights set out to capture the Duke. This game was becoming more and more interesting to him. Feeling a terrible pressure and incomprehensible loud sounds, Duke jumped up in his bed with horror on his face. His heart thudded in his chest from fear. The man looked around and started shouting, not realizing where his guards had gone. Dark circles lightly under the Duke's eyes, due to the excitement he was experiencing. One of the knights burst into the Duke's bedroom and immediately began asking the Duke to get out of the residence sooner rather than later. The warrior was too frightened, tears streaming from his eyes. He could only tell the Duke that the real Lich had come to them. Hearing this name, Duke Birchin immediately twitched. He knew this name, and a cold fear ran through the man's body. He didn't want to believe what he had heard until the last moment. While the Duke was giving orders, they didn't even notice the dark magic spilling down the corridors of the residence. Dex sensed and saw all the places his power could reach. His eyes narrowed as he found who he was looking for. Feeling the approach of dark forces, Duke froze in place. The man was in complete fear for his life. 3 knights rushed into the Duke's bedroom, but they were all already skeletons and had too intimidating a look. Dark magic vibrated around them. Those who were still alive also felt the approach of a terrible force. The guys turned around and were horrified to see in front of them the loss that had overtaken them. In just a moment, the blood of the warriors had already been spilled. Unclean frowned at the back of the defeated knight and intercepted his sword. The man was terrified and ordered him not to come near him. He could not understand at all where the dead could come from in his residence. But the dead didn't care about Duke Birchin's orders. They slowly began to advance towards him. At some point, the Duke noticed the weapons held by the dead men, and to his great horror, Birchin recognized the sword. Not so long ago, the dead man who was now looming over him was a knight ready to give his life at any moment for Duke Birchin's sake. Birchin took a closer look at the dead and immediately realized that they had all once been alive and serving him. The Duke trembled. Now, the words that the Lich had come here were not mere fiction. Bertrand had seen with his own eyes that the necromancer had appeared in the kingdom of Maron. Behind the dead appeared one living man. Dex slowly walked towards the Duke. In a low voice and with a slight smirk, the player greeted Duke Berhane. More than anything else, the man did not expect to see this young man in his bedroom, surrounded by dead men. A desperate laugh escaped his lips. The player's lips stretched even wider. He really wanted something, and now he would be able to fulfill his wish. The moment Duke Bertrand heard the young man state his wish, the man shuddered, for he had come only to destroy the Duke. That was the player's only wish. So whatever words the Duke might say now would have no meaning. Tears came to Bertrand's eyes. He aged a dozen years in the blink of an eye. Wrinkles appeared on his face that he hadn't had before that night. Dex chuckled. It was sad that the Duke still hadn't figured it out. After all, the man should have chosen well the people he wanted to take advantage of. Dex moved closer, talking about how he would like to see the battle and that he wouldn't mind seeing the Duke on the throne. But there was a small reason why Dex would have to destroy him. The player's face contorted. The reason was that he was pissed off. The Duke looked at the player with horror. They both didn't know if there was any other life in store for the MPS, but one thing they were sure of was that there was no way to lose. Duke Bertrand's screams grew with every word he began to beg the player for mercy, promising to do anything he wished. The three dead men began to advance towards the man. They could not disobey the Lord's will. The Duke's bedroom was illuminated with a red light. One of the dead men swung his sword sharply, with tongues of dark magic rapidly developing on it. And in just a second, his head was cut from his shoulders. Duke Bertrand lost all his hopes and dreams. This night, his reign ended. After all the signs popped up all around Dex, grinned when one showed he had gotten 53,000 decency. As soon as Dex had the decency points, Tansik and Ellie immediately started praising their host. They were incredibly happy for him. Dex wanted to know if there were any limits on strength. Tunchi rubbed his hands together happily while his master had decency points. This fact made the player very happy. He raised his hand, in which the dark power played out, and a smile shone on his face. At that very moment, Duke Bertrand's body began to rise in the air. His severed head was still hovering near his body. Controlling his unstoppable power, Dex smiled, for he could still destroy so much around him. The Duke's head snapped back to his body. The man's eyes were filled with emptiness. He was no longer the man he used to be. That same night, it was not peaceful in the Holy Empire of Shanch. High Priest Amen raised his head and looked at the moon that was streaming through his window. A strange uneasiness filled the man's heart. Amen jerked his head in the direction from which he had heard the address. At this late hour, he didn't expect anyone else to be awake. A young girl appeared in the doorway. Her long hair was loose, and her face was sad. Saint Sylvia was troubled by something. The girl asked the man to give her some time. He was surprised because he didn't expect to see her here. The girl's voice was too quiet and sad. She said that somewhere on the mainland of Arcadia, a dark force had spilled over. The High Priest's gaze immediately became sharp and serious. He thought in an instant about the dark power, and the only one who could create it. Amen approached the girl. His timbre vibrated, and yet he spoke courteously. The girl was exhausted, and began to remember everything she had seen. The name Duke Bertrand was called, and the man immediately recognized the title. He realized that it was the most powerful man in the kingdom of Maron. If Sylvia saw a vision connected to this man, then he's already dead. And a dark force has spilled over into the kingdom of Maron. Saint Sylvia could no longer hold back her tears. Pressing her palms to her face, the girl sobbed in helplessness. Amen went over to the young girl and put his arm around her to comfort her. He talked about how she was safe, and it was all just a dream. Another man suddenly appeared in the hall. The man immediately knelt down, ready to carry out any order from the holy priest. Egudiel was a holy knight of the highest class. The man raised his head. His eyes were filled with courage and determination. He had come to hear a new order. The high priest of the Holy Empire, Shaint, thanked the knight for responding. So soon, Amen told him to go to the kingdom of Maron. Meanwhile, the darkness had completely engulfed the Duke's residence. The place was in chaos. Dex swung his hand, releasing the dark power and putting the finishing touches on his creation. It was the end for this place. Being on the height of the roof of the neighboring house, the guy watched what was going on below. In front of him again appeared signs. The player threw the hood off his head and smiled satisfied with his work. If only Dex had known he could play as a necromancer. But then he hesitated, because then he'd have to see dead people every day. The player raised his arm around which pulsed a dark force. It was a powerful weapon, but Dex didn't want to use it all the time. Tansik looked relaxed until he was approached by Dex, who wanted to know how many decency points he had spent for using this power. The demon was not confused, and took out a huge calculator and began to calculate as if his vocation in this life was accounting. After a while, the demon was able to calculate that fewer decency points had been spent than Dex had earned on this mission. Dex noticed that the demon almost called him a simpleton, but Tansik quickly came to his senses and assured him that it was not the case. In any case, Dex didn't like the amount that Tansik had calculated. The guy ordered the demon to lower the price. Satan twitched at the surprise. He thought Dex wouldn't dare demand such a thing. Demon began to resist, because this was not a bazaar where you could bargain. Dex did not even want to hear anything and insisted on lowering the price. The demon's hand clenched. He was out of anger at his master's behavior. He really didn't want to lower the price for the power he could give him. Dex was undeterred. The player immediately threatened Tansik that if he didn't do something about the price, he'd only cooperate with Ellie. Hearing that statement, Ellie immediately shone like a little starlet. She'd be happy to get all the points and not have to share them with a demon. Satan couldn't let that happen and immediately started dropping the price. If he remains without integrity, he can't regain his former power. The amount he heard didn't suit Dex, so he ruthlessly removed the whole 10,000 points from it. The guys got into a vicious verbal fight, and Ellie witnessed it. After a while, Tansich and Dex were able to come up with a price that would suit them both. Demon assured me that it wouldn't go any lower. They ended up shaking hands, even though the demon's hand was 10 times smaller than the player's hand. In front of Dex, again popped up windows with notifications he was given another title, but most of all, the player was surprised that his negotiation skill was raised to the 7th level. Tanchik was shattered by this outcome and clutched his head. He didn't realize how he managed to bargain down to such a low price. Dex turned back towards the residence and took another look at his creation. The manor had suffered greatly from his will. Dex asked his companions to stay here for the time being, but the player was about to leave the game for a while. Tansik and Ellie stared at Dex in surprise. Dex was staring off into the distance, wanting only to finish what he'd started, and Ellie watched him with interest. Jae-yoon lazily spun his mouse wheel and studied Arcadia's newsfeed, as well as the forums where players shared their impressions. Dex stretched out his arm. He had all the materials he needed to carry out his plan. The guy smiled, because all he had to do was to provide all this information correctly, and then the young rich man from GM Group would pay him back in full. In the past, Yoon Jae-yoon was fond of MMORPG games. These were open-world computer games. It also wasn't the first time the guy had run into companies like Jegu or GM Group. That's why Jae-yoon had a lot of experience. He found the most suitable methods. From the moment the thought of punishing and framing Mr. GM Group crept into Jae-yoon's head, the first thing he did was to collect a lot of video material that will help him in the realization of his plan. The first thing the guy did was open the footage file, and there was footage of Choi talking to Duke Birchin. Jae-yoon chuckled softly, satisfied that he had not in vain sent Tanchika and Ellie to watch them. The boys' fingers quickly ran across the keyboard. In one passage, the Duke spoke of the profits they would make if the battle did go ahead. Then, there was talk of the likely profits they could make on the grain they had bought in advance, as well as mocking the players. Jae-yoon was very pleased with the way the video folded into one coherent and very unfavorable picture. And when it was complete, the guy uploaded this video to his channel with a very catchy title. Of course, Jae-gyu himself saw the video. He was sitting in front of his computer and couldn't believe it was happening to him. The horror of the number of views and those comments left by ordinary players covered the youngster from head to toe. From behind Jae-gyu's back appeared Smith. The man chuckled into his fist. Despite the fact that the ward had fallen, the man was surprised that he was able to get past Jae-gyu shouted out. They continued to stare dumbly at the monitor and discuss how it was possible that the conversation was recorded when no one was in the room. Jae-gyu's anger was so strong that the guy clenched his fist and slammed it into the screen monitor. The screen immediately cracked and went out. The young man's anger was too great, hot blood flowed from his fist, but now it was not about the wounds he promised himself that he would find out who could make such a video. John Smith put his hand on the shoulder of his heated ward. The man advised the youngster to attend to more important matters. The young man's phone began to vibrate sharply. The guy lowered his gaze and saw that it was the chairman calling. If the chairman himself called his youngest son, then he already knew about the video and that his plan had failed. The news anchor went straight to the hot news and the incident that happened in Arcadia. Further talked about how much money was invested in the game through GM Group. As a consequence, GM Group are expecting a statement from the commission soon. Lee Moo-young folded her arms across her chest and listened to the news about the company incident without much emotion. The girl laughed. She was surprised. In memory, such a large-scale event where a virtual game affected the outside world in such a way was the first time. Myung-chan looked at his boss in surprise. He decided it would be better to interrogate her for publishing these news items. The girl rose abruptly from her desk and fully agreed to the publication of this news. She wanted this case to be an example to other companies. The man was even more surprised when Moo-young fearlessly waited for the GM to do anything. She was willing to take any risks. She looked at the director with a sharp look in her eyes. The man had no choice but to agree. They can't have any more of this kind of antics from the big companies. She was glad it was like that. But the girl was very worried about the player who posted the video. The headmaster's voice became ingratiating. The girl smilingly admired how events were developing. After all, the actions of one player had caused quite a stir. She turned her head towards the window and sunlight lay on her face. Moo-young worried whether one single player had taken on too great a burden. Jae-yoon yawned sweetly on the table in the auditorium. He was too tired from the gameplay and everything that was going on right now. Jae-young, on the contrary, was full of vigor and vigor. The student jumped up sharply to Jae-yoon and spoke excitedly about the news and all that had happened to GM Group. Sleepy. Jae-yoon raised his head and pretended not to be aware of this matter. He was not clear why such a great company was engaged in childish games. Jae-en raised his head and with incredible pride and confidence assured his friend that Arcadia was not just a game, but a real separate world. The guy leaned on his arm and smirked. He didn't want to argue with the student, so he quickly agreed with his assertions. Jae-yoon looked around the audience and saw other people's reactions to the news that had been circulating everywhere. The people's reactions were exactly what the guy wanted. Choi Jae-gyu was currently in the crosshairs of all journalists. There have been many debates about trading speculation using a virtual game. Jae-yoon read the news that was being talked about right now, and which involved such a reputable company with a smile on his face. A new professor approached the department. The man greeted all those sitting in the auditorium. Conversations immediately subsided, and the students' attention was fixed on the professor. Kang Pil-jun cheerfully introduced himself, telling all the seated students that he was from the R&D department. As the man talked a lot of unnecessary things, the students began to sigh. They were more interested in getting to the lecture itself. Jae-yoon listened to Pil-jun with interest. The demon perched on a tree branch and yawned sweetly. He was bored and wanted to see his master as soon as possible. Suddenly, Tenshik felt the magic power. He immediately opened his eyes and tensed his whole body. When the demon turned around, he noticed an ascended flag that was developing in the wind. It bore the symbol of the star and the sun, the sign of the saints. An unprecedented, powerful energy flowed from the people who were marching as a Gudiel. The Holy Knight led the procession and led the knights behind him. The demon sensed a great danger to his life. Scowling, he looked around for Ellie. He needed to get out of this place as soon as possible. The dead rose up before a Gudiel. They clanked their jaws and were not going to let the Holy Knight pass any further away. Only the Holy Knight of the highest rank was not at all afraid of the fearsome dead. Raising his hand in front of him, the man called down, light from the heavens. A Gudiel's power immediately penetrated the bodies of the dead. They screamed, unable to hold their defenses. The light was too destructive for the undead. And just a few moments later, not a single enemy was left in front of the Holy Knight. Empty armor collapsed to the ground, and the bony bodies were incinerated. The man bowed his knee to the empty armor. He said a prayer, wishing the departed to sleep in peace. He was angry that St. Sylvia's vision had been true. He grimaced in frustration and cursed himself that they hadn't found out sooner. At this point, the investigation of this case was over. Gudiel stated the fact that the middle to upper-class wickedness in front of them was a fact. The man turned his head and gave orders to go to the high priest and report all that had happened here. Meanwhile, Pil-jun was excitedly talking about the reason why he got to lecture to these students today. It was decided to conduct a test. Virtual reality technology is necessarily related to the human brain. However, everyone is different, and brains are just as different from the rest of us. The man turned his focused gaze around the entire audience. He hoped that within these walls, they would find talent. Now the students were already more interested in the professor's words. The guys listened to him very attentively, the same way Jae-yoon was completely absorbed in Pil-jun's words. Between the brain and the machine could be measured as a percentage of the transmission speed. The higher it was, the faster the information was perceived. Pil-jun asked the students to take this test and see if there was anyone with this talent. Kang Taeseo raised his hand up. The guy fearlessly was willing to take this test first. He looked very confident in his abilities. Some were surprised by such a strong zeal of the student girls. On the contrary, began to discuss the beauty of this student, forgetting about the most important thing. At the same moment, Jae-yoon hesitated and lowered his head with a dejected look. Jae-yoon immediately noticed his friend's changed mood and quietly decided to find out what was wrong. Jae-yoon glanced at the student who was walking down to the pulpit. He remembered that this guy was in the same class at school with Jae-young. Jae-yoon also knew that the girl Jae-young likes is on good terms with Kang Taeseo, and they are in the same association where this student was the head student. Pushing aside extraneous thoughts, Jae-yoon returned his eyes to the lectern. Putting his head on his palm, the guy was interested in this lecture. As the student passed by Jae-yoon, the guy felt a strange pulse that made his whole body twitch and his eyes widened. Kang Taeseong noticed this and couldn't help but comment. There was a note of arrogance in the student's voice. The student and the professor greeted each other, and the man invited the guy to follow him. But Jae-yoon was watching with great curiosity. He didn't seem to directly dislike this student in his direction. Excitement rose in the guy's soul. The student was placed in the capsule, and goggles were placed on his face. Pil-jun was standing next to him with his assistant. He said that the capsule could measure the synchronization speed. A slight anxiety overtook the student lying in the capsule, but he heard the professor's voice and relaxed a little when he assured him that the procedure was completely safe. Pil-jun took his tablet in his hands with great enthusiasm. The man was already eager to start exploring. The student's only thought was to prove to everyone else how capable he was, but most of all, he wanted to belittle his friend, Jae-yoon. Thinking back to Jae-yoon's face, Kang Taeseo could say with certainty that this student was strange, and he didn't like him. The capsule started working, and numbers appeared above it. This was the score that could determine Kang Taeseo's brain synchronization. Pil-jun was shocked at such a great result. He immediately fixed his glasses and lowered his gaze into the clipboard. This result was good. Taeseo climbed out of the capsule and took off his goggles. The professor noticed that if only a little more, and the student would be able to break the record, which consisted of 26%. Pil-jun returned his gaze to the audience and was more excited to find the next person willing to take this test. The desire to humiliate the unpleasant man took over. Taeseo extended his finger forward and pointed at one of the students. At the same moment, all the students immediately turned their heads to see who Taeseo was pointing at, and it was Jae-yoon. The guy had a feeling something like this would happen. His lips stretched into a venomous grin. After all, that kid didn't know who he was up against yet. JN immediately started apologizing to his friend, feeling guilty for what had happened. Jae-yoon grinned at the guy who rashly decided to challenge him. Tae-seo was all but convinced. After a couple of minutes, Jae-yoon had already laid down in the capsule with the virtual reality goggles on his head. Even in that position, the smile on the student's face was still on his face. Suddenly, the auditorium was lit up with a bright glow. The percentages above the capsule seemed to go crazy and grew so fast that it seemed unreal. Jae-yoon couldn't take his enthusiastic gaze away from the capsule and the percentages that kept increasing. He was shocked by this result. The assistant, seeing what was happening, suspected a malfunction of the capsule and voiced her concerns. But Piljun himself was in no hurry to stop the test. The man was fully convinced that it was not a mistake. The student who had gone into that capsule was the cause of this outcomes. The percentages above the capsule froze and never moved again. Such synchronization seemed unreal, a full 89%. Piljun was so shocked by this result that he was not immediately able to control his emotions. The man asked the student to come out. Kang Taejun's smug face twisted with surprise. He was so eager to brag about his brilliant result. The other students were just as surprised by this result and watched breathlessly as the professor asked Jae-yoon more questions. Jae-yoon took off his glasses and lied to Piljun about never playing Arcadia. He didn't want anyone to find out.